Before the world learned the name El Alamein, there was only the wind, tracing invisible paths across an endless, golden ocean of sand. Close your eyes, and imagine standing at the edge of the world. The horizon stretches out in every direction, a perfect, unbroken line where the pale, sun-bleached earth meets the vast, aching curve of the sky. There are no trees here. There are no rivers, no gentle green hills, no soft valleys to cradle a tired mind. There is only the desert, ancient and indifferent, whispering in a language of dust and stone. It is a place of profound, terrifying beauty, a place that makes a human being feel as small and fragile as a single grain of sand caught in the breeze. Into this great, silent emptiness came the young men of the world. They arrived by the thousands, carried across the Mediterranean from lands so different from this one that the desert must have felt like another planet entirely. There were boys from the damp, fog-wrapped streets of London, and from the quiet, rolling pastures of the English countryside. There were young men from the dark, fragrant pine forests of Bavaria, and the sunlit olive groves of Italy. There were shepherds from the high mountains of New Zealand, and farmers from the vast, open plains of Australia. They were sons and brothers, bakers and clerks, students and poets, suddenly uprooted from everything soft and familiar, and placed down in the center of an unforgiving wasteland. When they first stepped off the transports, the heat hit them like a physical weight. It was a dry, heavy pressure that instantly stole the moisture from their lips and made the air shimmer and dance, turning the distant dunes into watery mirages. They had been given uniforms and rifles, told to march, told to dig, told to wait. But nothing could have prepared them for the overwhelming, absolute reality of the sand. It was everywhere. It was not just beneath their boots, it was a living, breathing entity that permeated every hour of their existence. It sifted through the tightest laces of their boots. It coated their eyelashes and gathered in the corners of their eyes. When they opened their ration tins, a fine layer of grit would settle on their food before the first bite. When they tried to sleep, the sand was in their blankets, scratching against their sunburned skin. It became the texture of their lives. And yet, in the face of this overwhelming landscape, you could see the quiet, stubborn resilience of the human spirit. Imagine a small canvas tent, baked by the midday sun, offering just a few feet of precious, heavy shade. Inside, 3 young men are huddled together. They are not talking about empires, or strategy, or the great sweeping movements of armies. They are sharing a single, battered tin cup of water. It is warm, and it tastes of metal and iodine, but it is passed from hand to hand with a reverence that borders on the holy. One of the boys, barely out of school, takes his sip and wipes his mouth, leaving a streak of clean skin on his dirt-caked face. He looks at his companion, an older man who used to repair shoes in a quiet village, and manages a small, cracked smile. Tastes just like the tea at the Ritz, the young boy whispers, his voice dry and hoarse. The older man chuckles, a soft, rasping sound. Better, he replies. The Ritz never had a view like this. It was these small, invisible moments of grace that kept the men tethered to their humanity. In a place that offered no comfort, they became comfort for one another. They learned to read the subtle changes in a friend's breathing, knowing without asking when the homesickness had become too heavy to bear. They learned to share the meager shade of a rusted truck tire, leaning shoulder to shoulder in the dust, finding solace in the simple warmth of another living soul. As the sun began its slow descent, the character of the desert would change entirely. The blinding white heat of the afternoon would soften, melting into rich, bruised colors of violet, indigo, and burnt orange. The shadows of the dunes would stretch out, long and mournful across the desert floor. And with the setting sun came the great, sudden cold. The desert did not hold its heat, it surrendered it to the night sky, leaving the men shivering in their woolen coats, pressing close to the small, smokeless fires they managed to build from scrub and dried thorns. It was in this quiet hour, between the fading of the light and the deep dark of the night, that the desert belonged to the heart. This was the hour of the letters. Picture a young soldier, sitting on the edge of a shallow trench he has dug with his own blistered hands. The air is growing sharply cold against his cheeks. He balances a small, lined notepad on his knee, shielding a stub of a pencil from the restless wind. He bites his lip, searching for the right words to send across the sea to a small cottage he hopes is still standing. He does not write about the fear that sits like a cold stone in his stomach. He does not write about the days without washing, or the terrible, roaring sounds that sometimes break the silence of the horizon. He writes, instead, of the sky. My dearest mother, he writes, pressing the lead gently into the paper. I hope this letter finds the garden in bloom. You would not believe the stars out here. Without the city lights, the sky is so full of them it looks like a field of frost. It is very quiet tonight. I am eating well, and the boys in my section are looking after me. Please do not worry. I wrap my scarf tightly when the wind blows. Miles away, across the invisible line drawn in the sand, another young man sits in the exact same posture, under the exact same stars. He writes in a different language, to a different mother, but the words are a mirror image. Liebe Mutter, he writes. The night is cold, but the sky is beautiful. I am safe. I am thinking of the warmth of the kitchen stove. They were enemies, bound by the strange, cruel rules of a world at war, but in the silence of the desert night, they were exactly the same. They were boys made of flesh and bone, wrapped in wool, clutching pieces of paper that held the scent of home. They were all small ships lost on the same vast, waterless ocean, navigating by the same cold stars. The desert did not care about the colors of their uniforms. The desert did not care about the flags they flew or the anthems they sang. To the ancient sand, they were all just passing shadows, brief and fragile against the eternity of the dunes. The wind would blow, and their footprints would vanish. The sun would rise, and their trenches would crumble. This deep sense of isolation bred a unique kind of quiet dread. It wasn't the sharp, panicky terror of sudden danger, but a slow, creeping weight. It was the feeling of being completely detached from the world they knew, marooned on a lifeless shore. They would sit for hours, watching the heat haze dance on the horizon, waiting for a breeze that never came, waiting for an order that would plunge them into the unknown. The waiting was its own kind of burden. It gave the mind too much time to wander back to green fields, to the smell of fresh bread, to the touch of a loved one's hand. To survive the waiting, they built tiny routines. A man might spend an hour meticulously cleaning a pair of spectacles, wiping every grain of sand from the hinges with a scrap of cloth. Another might carve small, intricate animals out of discarded bits of wood, leaving them perched on the edge of the sandbags like little guardians. They talked of ordinary things in low, hushed voices. They debated the best way to brew tea, or the exact layout of the streets in their hometowns, clinging to these mundane details as if they were life rafts. There was a profound, everyday heroism in simply waking up and facing the sun. It took courage to smile at a frightened comrade when your own heart was heavy. It took bravery to hand over the last few drops in a canteen. These were not the actions that would be written about in grand history books. There would be no medals for the boy who stayed awake an extra hour just to let his exhausted friend sleep. There would be no monuments built for the man who hummed a gentle lullaby to calm the shaking shoulders of a younger soldier in the dark. But out here, in the ocean of sand, these small moments of grace were everything. They were the invisible threads that held the men together when the world around them threatened to tear them apart. As the night deepened, the silence of the desert became absolute. It was a silence so heavy, so profound, that a man could hear the blood rushing in his own ears. It was a silence that seemed to swallow sound, absorbing the low murmurs of the men, the metallic clink of a rifle bolt, the shifting of the sand beneath a restless boot. Look down at them now, scattered across the pale earth under the watchful eyes of the constellations. They are sleeping, huddled in their greatcoats, dreaming of places where water falls freely from the sky and the ground is soft beneath their feet. The wind picks up, a low, sorrowful whisper that sweeps across the dunes, carrying a fine mist of sand over the sleeping camps. It dances over the canvas tents, over the cold steel of the machinery resting in the dark, over the faces of the young men who have traveled so far to reach this quiet, desolate place. They are waiting. The desert is waiting. And as the stars turn slowly overhead, marking the passage of the long, cold night, the ocean of sand keeps its secrets, holding its breath for the dawn. Even the men we carve into legends are, in the quiet dark, only flesh and bone, carrying the fragile weight of a heavy heart. The world far away had given him a name that sounded like a myth. They called him a fox. They painted him as a phantom of the dunes, a master of the vast, shifting chessboard of North Africa, a man who could command the wind and the sand to do his bidding. But out here, where the sun bleaches the sky to a pale, aching white, there are no myths. There is only the unforgiving reality of the earth. Out here, there was only a man named Erwin. Let us step away from the grand maps, from the sweeping, confident arrows drawn by historians, and look, instead, into a small, stifling canvas tent, pitched against the indifferent expanse of the desert. The heat inside this tent is not merely a temperature, it is a heavy, living entity. It presses against the canvas roof, baking the air inside until it is thick and difficult to breathe. It smells of hot canvas, old paper, and the ever-present, metallic tang of dust. At a small, folding wooden table, the commander sits alone. The famous goggles, the ones seen in all the newsreels, rest abandoned next to a flickering kerosene lamp. His face is not the face of a conqueror. It is hollowed by weeks of relentless illness, lined with a deep, dusty exhaustion that reaches all the way to his soul. The desert, you see, does not respect rank. It treats the general exactly as it treats the youngest, most frightened private shivering in a trench. It demands the same toll from every human body that dares to walk across its surface. Erwin's hands, resting on the rough wood of the table, tremble ever so slightly. He has been sick for a long time. The same hollow ache of dysentery that plagues his soldiers twists in his own stomach. The same desert sores bloom on his sunburned skin. The same terrible, dry thirst coats his throat, making it difficult to swallow. He is a man whose body is slowly, quietly surrendering to the landscape. He pushes a stack of urgent, bleak reports to the side. The numbers on those pages only tell a story of dwindling supplies, of empty fuel barrels, of exhausted boys who have nothing left to give. He cannot bear to look at them right now. Instead, he reaches for a simple sheet of plain paper and a fountain pen. He carefully unscrews the cap, the scratch of the metal loud in the suffocating quiet of the tent. He begins to write. Dearest Lou, he writes, his handwriting sloping slightly as his heavy eyelids droop. It is in these quiet, stolen moments, by the pale yellow light of a solitary lamp, that the heavy armor of command finally falls away. He does not write to his wife of glorious charges or brilliant maneuvers. He writes of his bone-deep weariness. He tells her how heavy his head feels today, how the fever comes and goes like the slow, sweeping tide of a dark ocean. He writes of the profound strangeness of this place, how the fine, powdery sand seems to seep into his very soul, coating his memories of home. He misses her. He misses the soft, cool, green hills of their homeland. He misses the gentle patter of rain against the windowpane, a sound he has not heard in what feels like a lifetime. He writes to his young son, Manfred, asking about school, about his dog, desperately trying to anchor himself to the simple, beautiful rhythm of a life that does not involve the constant, thrumming hum of distant artillery. In the flowing ink of these letters, the brilliant tactician entirely disappears. What remains is only a lonely, ailing husband and father, reaching across a burning sea, trying to hold his family's hands in the dark. He pauses his writing, resting his aching head in his hands, closing his eyes against the sting of the dust. Outside, the camp is settling into the uneasy, fragile sleep of the front line. The wind begins to pick up, a low, sorrowful whisper that rattles the canvas of his tent. Carried on that wind, he can hear the low, raspy coughs of his men. He thinks of them out there in the dark. The young boys from quiet farms and bustling cities set out into this vast wasteland, trusting him completely. They trust him to know the way, to find the water, to bring them safely back to the mothers and wives waiting for them. He feels every single one of those thousands of lives resting directly on his own chest. It is a weight heavier than any steel tank, heavier than any shell. How does a man sleep, knowing that so many families are praying for the boys he has had to place directly in the path of the coming storm? The tent flap rustles, breaking his reverie. A young aide, his uniform faded white by the sun and stained with grease, steps inside gently, trying not to make a sound. He carries a small, dented tin cup. "A little tea, Her General," the boy whispers. His voice is gentle, almost tender. He looks at his commander, seeing the pale, drawn cheeks, the exhaustion etched deep into the corners of his eyes, and in that moment, the boy feels a quiet surge of protective pity for the man who is supposed to protect them all. Erwin looks up, managing a weak, incredibly tired smile. "Thank you," he murmurs, his voice barely more than a dry rasp. He reaches out, and as he takes the cup, his fingers briefly brush against the warm, calloused hand of the young aide. For a fleeting second, they are not a legendary general and a lowly subordinate. They are just two very tired, very vulnerable men, infinitely far from home, sharing a small, quiet kindness in the vast, unforgiving dark. The tea is bitter, brewed with the brackish, salty water of the desert, but to a parched throat, it is a momentary blessing, a tiny drop of comfort in an ocean of hardship. The days blur together into a seamless haze of blinding light and choking dust. Erwin's body is failing him more with every sunrise. The medical officers whisper among themselves in hushed tones, watching the way he leans heavily against his map tables, the way he struggles to draw a full breath in the suffocating heat. The desert is slowly draining the life from him, claiming him piece by piece. Yet, he tries so desperately to stand tall for the men. He knows they need the myth. They need the desert fox. When he rides past their shallow trenches in his open car, he forces his aching back straight. He pushes the pain down deep, offering a sharp salute, a confident, reassuring nod to the dust-covered faces that turn to watch him pass. But beneath the heavy, sweat-soaked wool of his tunic, his heart flutters with a sickening weakness, and the horizon spins wildly before his eyes. He looks at the faces of his soldiers as he drives by. They are like ghosts wrapped in rags. Their eyes are deeply sunken, their lips cracked and bleeding, their skin baked to the rough texture of the earth itself. Yet, when they see him, they look up with a fragile, desperate, beautiful hope. He is their talisman. He is the magic that has kept them alive this long against impossible odds. And seeing that hope breaks his heart into 1,000 pieces. He knows the truth. He knows how incredibly thin the line has become. He knows that the supply ships rest at the bottom of the sea, that the fuel gauges are tapping against empty, that the rations are nothing but a memory of sustenance. He loves these men. He loves these resilient, stubborn, endlessly patient men who have followed him without question to the very edge of the world. And it is a quiet, terrifying agony to realize that he might not be able to save them. Eventually, the human body simply says no. The orders come from far away, from healthy men sitting in comfortable, cool rooms on the continent, demanding that the commander return to Europe immediately for medical salvation. It is an order he fights with every ounce of his rapidly failing strength. To leave them now, with the great storm clouds gathering so darkly on the horizon, feels like a profound, unbearable betrayal of his soul. But he has no choice. He is too weak to stand. On the day he must finally depart, the desert is strangely, eerily still, as if holding its breath. He stands on the tarmac by the small aircraft that will carry him away from the sand. He does not look at his officers. He does not look at the maps or the machines of war. He turns and looks out toward the shimmering horizon, toward the invisible lines where his boys are dug deep into the hot earth, waiting in the silence. A profound sorrow washes over him, a quiet, desperate ache that settles deep in his bones. He had written to Lucy that he was finally coming home, to rest, to heal. But as the plane lifts off the ground, rising slowly into the pale, dusty sky, he knows the truth. He looks down through the small window at the tiny, scattered shapes of his army below, growing smaller and smaller until they blend completely into the endless golden ocean. He is a man torn perfectly in two. One half of him longs for the healing green of the mountains, for the soft, familiar touch of his wife's hand, for the cool, gentle rain on his face. But the other half, the heaviest half, remains forever buried in the warm sand, sitting in a shallow trench, sharing a bitter cup of water, bound eternally to the boys he had to leave behind in the shadow of the desert. Sometimes, hope does not arrive with the roar of a sudden storm, but with a quiet, almost imperceptible shift in the wind. For weeks, the men in the shallow trenches of El Alamein had known only the bitter, dusty taste of retreat. They had walked backward across hundreds of miles of unforgiving earth, leaving behind broken machinery, lost friends, and the heavy, lingering ghost of defeat. They were exhausted in a way that sleep could no longer cure. It was a weariness that settled deep into the marrow of their bones, making their limbs feel like lead and their thoughts slow and thick as honey. If you were to walk among them in those hazy, sweltering late summer days, you would see an army of hollow-eyed statues. They sat in the meager shade of their lorries, staring out at the shimmering horizon with an emptiness that was profoundly difficult to witness. They spoke very little. There was no energy left for grand conversations or the gentle teasing that usually bound young men together. When they did speak, it was in low, defeated murmurs, passing a tin of warm, sandy water, or sharing a single, precious match to light a ragged cigarette. They felt entirely forgotten by the world, pushed against the very edge of the sea, waiting for the final, inevitable wave to wash them away. They were waiting for the familiar, dreaded order to pack up their meager belongings and walk eastward once again. But then, the wind changed. It began as a rumor, a soft whisper passed from trench to trench, carried on the backs of dispatch riders and cooks, traveling through the lines like a gentle current in a still pond. A new man had arrived to take the heavy mantle of command. The tired soldiers had seen generals come and go. They were used to men with shining boots and distant, worried eyes who stood by map boards in Cairo, far away from the flies and the blinding heat. To the boy clutching a rifle in the dirt, a new general meant very little. It was just another name on a piece of paper, another phantom moving pieces across a board they could not see. But this man was different. He did not stay behind the thick walls of the city. He came out into the dust. Picture a small, wiry figure, stepping out of a mud-splattered car right at the edge of the front line. He did not wear the heavy, formal cap of a high commander. Instead, he wore a simple black beret, pulled sharply to the side, adorned with two overlapping badges. It was a small, eccentric detail, but to the men, it made him suddenly, surprisingly human. He had sharp, bright eyes that seemed to take in everything at once, the frayed edges of their uniforms, the hollows of their cheeks, the silent, desperate question hanging in the air. When he gathered them around, he did not demand the stiff, formal attention of a parade ground. He simply told them to draw close, to sit on the warm hoods of their jeeps, to lean on their rifles, and to listen. His voice was clear, sharp, and perfectly certain. It cut through the hazy dread that had smothered the camp for weeks. He told them, quite simply, that the retreat was over. He told them there would be no more looking over their shoulders. He told them that the plans for falling back, the papers detailing how to abandon this stretch of sand, were going to be burned. He said they would stand exactly where they were. If they could not live there, he told them gently but firmly, then they would die there. But they would not take another step backward. To a man sitting comfortably in a parlor reading a history book, those words might sound harsh, even terrifying. But to an exhausted soldier who has spent weeks running from a shadow, to a boy who has felt the ground constantly shifting beneath his boots, those words were an extraordinary gift. They were the gift of certainty. Imagine a young infantryman, his face smeared with grease and pale sand, listening to this strange, sharp-eyed man. For weeks, his heart has been a fluttering bird in his chest, gripped by the anxiety of the unknown. Will we move tonight? Will we run tomorrow? Will I be left behind? But as he listens to the new commander, the fluttering slowly stops. A deep, steady breath fills his lungs. For the first time in a long time, the earth beneath his worn boots feels solid. He doesn't have to wonder anymore. He just has to stand his ground. The terrible, exhausting burden of uncertainty has been lifted from his young shoulders, carried away by a man in a black beret. That evening, the atmosphere in the camp was palpably different. It was not joyous, there was no cheering, no sudden burst of foolish bravery. They all knew the storm was still coming. But the frantic, suffocating panic had evaporated. In the twilight, as the sky turned a bruised, beautiful violet, small fires flickered to life across the dunes. But this time, they were not just brewing tea. The men watched, in quiet fascination, as their officers brought out thick sheaves of paper, the contingency plans, the defensive retreats, the maps showing the roads back to the river. One by one, they were tossed into the flames. The paper curled and blackened, turning into fragile gray ash that drifted up toward the newly appearing stars. A young corporal, leaning against a stack of sandbags, watched the embers rise. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn piece of chocolate he had been saving for days. He broke it in half and handed a piece to the man beside him without a word. They ate in silence, watching the ashes of their retreat float away into the night sky. It was a profound, quiet moment of shared relief. They were no longer victims of the wind, they were finally a wall against it. Later that night, the ocean of sand grew cold, and the hour of the letters began once again. But the words that flowed from the pencil tips had changed. A young artilleryman, sitting cross-legged under the vast, starry canopy, balanced his notebook on his knee. He thought of his wife, sleeping in a quiet house a world away. "My darling," he wrote, the pencil moving with a new, calm rhythm. "The air feels clearer tonight. We had a visit today from the new man in charge. He's a strange fellow, looks right through you, but he speaks plain English. He told us we aren't going anywhere. You can't imagine what a relief it is to hear it. We are going to stay right here and face it. The lads are quiet tonight, but it's a good quiet. It's the kind of quiet you have when you finally know what you have to do. I am not afraid anymore. I feel settled." He folded the paper carefully, slipping it into a battered envelope. Around him, the camp was settling into sleep. But it was a different kind of sleep than the nights before. It was not the restless, twitching slumber of the hunted. It was the deep, restorative rest of men who had finally been given a purpose. They were still far from home. They were still surrounded by an endless, indifferent wasteland. But as the desert night wrapped its cold arms around them, they were no longer a broken, fleeing remnant. They were a family of soldiers, stitched back together by a few simple words and a quiet shift in the wind. They closed their eyes, breathing in the cool, night air, listening to the gentle hum of the camp. The sand beneath them felt a little less like a graveyard, and a little more like home. They were ready to wait for the dawn, anchored to the earth, finding a strange, beautiful peace in the simple act of standing still. There is a specific, heavy kind of silence that falls just before the world breaks apart. It is the silence of the waiting. In the long, unbroken stretch of days before the sky finally caught fire, the desert at El Alamein became a purgatory of stagnant heat and suspended time. The men on both sides of the invisible line found themselves trapped in a strange, agonizing limbo. They knew a storm was coming. They could feel it in the air, a tension so thick it seemed to vibrate against their skin. But until that moment arrived, There was absolutely nothing to do but sit in the sweltering heat and wait. The sun in those final days was not just a light in the sky, it was a physical weight pressing down upon the earth. It bleached the heavens to a pale, aching white, stripping the landscape of any shadow or relief. The men sought shelter wherever they could find it, retreating into the shallow, oven-like trenches they had carved into the baked earth, or huddling beneath the fragile canvas of their tents. The air inside these small, shadowed spaces was perfectly still, smelling of hot dust, old wool, and the sour, sharp scent of nervous sweat. Time did not move in hours or minutes here. It moved in the slow crawl of a single bead of sweat down a dusty cheek. It moved in the shifting of the sun across a patch of canvas. It moved in the quiet, methodical passing of a shared water tin. Imagine two young men, sitting shoulder to shoulder in the suffocating heat of a dugout. Their uniforms are stiff with dried salt and pale earth. Between them rests a dented metal canteen. Water was more precious than gold in this ocean of sand. It was measured out in meager, metallic sips, hoarded and treasured. One man takes the canteen, his hands trembling slightly, not from fear, but from the sheer exhaustion of existing in this furnace. He tips it to his cracked lips, letting just a few warm, iodine-laced drops wet his tongue. He does not swallow immediately, he holds the water in his mouth, letting it soothe the raw, dry ache in his throat. When he lowers the canteen, he does not wipe his mouth. He passes it carefully to his friend. Their eyes meet for a brief second. No words are spoken. They do not need to speak. In that simple passing of the tin, there is a profound, quiet understanding, a shared acknowledgement of their mutual suffering and their silent, desperate will to endure. It was in this agonizing waiting game, trapped between the burning sky and the baking earth, that the men turned to their only remaining lifeline to the world they had left behind. They turned to the fragile, fluttering pieces of paper buried in their breast pockets. This was the time of the letters. All along the miles of trenches, across the vast, shimmering expanse of the desert, thousands of men sat in the dust, balancing worn notebooks on their knees, shielding their paper from the blinding glare of the sun. To write a letter in the desert was an act of profound hope. It was a refusal to let the vastness of the wasteland erase the memory of who they were. Picture a young soldier, his face smeared with grease and pale sand, a stub of a pencil gripped tightly in his calloused fingers. He is thousands of miles from the damp, green hills of his home. Around him, the air hums with the dizzying heat and the low, persistent buzz of flies. But as he presses the lead to the paper, the desert slowly fades away. He does not write about the terrible, stretching silence. He does not write about the knot of dread sitting heavy in his stomach, or the way his hands shake when he tries to light a cigarette. He writes, instead, of the rain. My dearest, he writes, his handwriting slow and deliberate, trying to keep the letters neat despite the rough surface of his knees. I closed my eyes today and tried to remember the exact sound the rain makes when it hits the roof of the shed. It is so dry here, you cannot imagine it. The dust gets into everything. But when I think of the garden and the way the wet earth smells in the morning, I feel a little cooler. I am keeping my head down. The boys in my section are a good sort. We look out for one another. Please, do not worry for me. I am safe, and I am always thinking of you. He pauses, licking his dry lips, staring out at the wavering heat haze on the horizon. For a moment, he is not a soldier waiting for a battle. He is just a boy, sitting by a window, watching the rain fall on green grass. The memory is so vivid it brings a sudden, sharp ache to his chest, a homesickness so deep it is almost physical. But he blinks it away, returning his focus to the small, white square of paper. It is his tether. It is the invisible string connecting his heart to the soft, gentle world he fears he may never see again. And across the expanse of sand, beyond the minefields and the barbed wire, another man sits in the exact same posture, holding the exact same hope. He is an older man, a father who once made his living carving wood in a quiet village surrounded by olive trees. His hands are rough and scarred, deeply tanned by the African sun. He is writing to his young daughter, a child whose face he tries desperately to hold in his mind before she grows too old and changes in his memory. "My little bird," he writes, the pencil moving in graceful, looping curves. "The stars here are brighter than any you have ever seen. At night, the sky looks like a great black blanket covered in crushed diamonds. I look at them and I know that you are sleeping under the very same sky. I am sending you a small stone I found in the sand today. It is perfectly smooth, polished by the wind. Keep it in your pocket, and know that your father loves you more than there are grains of sand in this desert." He smiles softly as he writes the words, a gentle, melancholic smile that softens the harsh lines the desert has carved into his face. In the act of writing, the enemy ceases to exist. There are no grand ideologies here, no maps, no flags. There is only the universal, desperate yearning for home, the quiet, shared humanity of men trying to comfort the people they love, even as they stand on the edge of the abyss. But the desert is a restless, impatient entity. It does not tolerate stillness for long. As the afternoon wears on, the agonizing quiet begins to change. The blinding white of the sky deepens into a strange, bruised yellow. The oppressive, stagnant heat is suddenly broken by a sharp, hot breath of wind that sweeps across the dunes, carrying with it a fine, stinging mist of sand. The men look up from their letters, their eyes narrowing against the sudden glare. They know what this light means. They know what this wind carries. It is the Khamsin, the great, suffocating sandstorm that rolls across the North African plains like a suffocating tidal wave. A low, haunting moan begins to build on the horizon, the sound of millions of grains of sand scraping against the earth. The yellow sky darkens to a deep, ominous orange, and then to a bruised, twilight brown. The sun vanishes completely, swallowed by the rising wall of dust. A sudden, quiet urgency ripples through the trenches. There is no panic, only the swift, practiced movements of men who have learned to survive the wrath of the landscape. They hastily fold their precious letters, tucking them safely into their breast pockets, buttoning their tunics tightly over their hearts. They reach for their scarves, wrapping the rough fabric over their noses and mouths, pulling their goggles down over their eyes. And then, the storm hits. It does not strike with the violent crash of thunder or the heavy, washing relief of rain. It descends with a blinding, choking fury. The wind howls, a deafening, rushing roar that drowns out all other sound. The air turns into a solid, abrasive wall of flying grit. It strips the paint from the metal of their vehicles, it stings against any exposed patch of skin like a swarm of tiny, angry bees, and it forces its way into every seam, every pocket, every lung. The men huddle deeper into their trenches, pulling their knees to their chests, turning their backs to the punishing wind. The storm isolates them completely. In the swirling, blinding brown chaos, a man cannot see the soldier sitting less than an arm's length away. The world shrinks down to the small, suffocating space beneath their canvas sheets, to the sound of their own ragged breathing echoing inside the fabric of their scarves. But even in the blinding dark of the storm, the small, quiet acts of heroism endure. A young boy, terrified and suffocating in the dark, feels the corner of his shelter tear away, exposing him to the full, blinding force of the wind. He curls into a ball, coughing violently as the dust fills his throat. Suddenly, he feels a heavy weight settle over his shoulders. A larger, older soldier has crawled through the blinding sand, dragging a heavy woolen blanket. The older man throws the blanket over both of their heads, creating a small, stifling, but protected pocket of air. They sit huddled together beneath the thick wool, their shoulders pressed tight against one another. The older man does not say a word, he cannot speak over the roar of the wind, but he reaches out and grips the younger boy's arm, a firm, steadying pressure in the chaos. In that terrifying, suffocating darkness, the simple warmth of another human body is a profound comfort. It is an anchor, a silent promise that they are not entirely alone in the void. For hours, the storm rages, a physical manifestation of the terrible tension that has been building in the camp. It feels as though the earth itself is screaming, protesting the violence that is about to be unleashed upon its surface. The men simply bow their heads and endure, their hands pressed over their pockets, protecting the fragile paper hearts they have written in the dust. When the wind finally, slowly begins to die down, it leaves behind a world completely transformed. The roaring howl fades into a gentle, settling sigh. The thick, brown air thins, revealing a pale, bruised twilight. The men cautiously push back their blankets and peek out from their trenches. Everything is buried. The sharp edges of their camp have been softened, covered in a thick, uniform layer of fine, pale powder. The men themselves look like ghosts, their faces, their uniforms, their weapons completely coated in the dust of the earth. They move slowly, stiffly, shaking the sand from their shoulders, coughing softly into their hands. The agonizing wait is still not over. The storm has passed, but the terrible silence has returned, heavier and more profound than before. But as the night sky finally reveals itself, sweeping away the last of the dust to show the cold, distant stars, a mail sack is quietly passed down the line. The men reach into their tunics, their fingers brushing over the pockets above their hearts. They pull out the small, crumpled envelopes, dusting them off with infinite care. They place the letters into the sack, watching as it is carried away into the dark. Those fragile pieces of paper, carrying dreams of rain, and green grass, and polished stones, will travel across the ocean, far away from the sand and the impending fire. The men watch the sack disappear, taking a part of their souls with it. And then, they turn back to the horizon, wrapping their coats tight against the evening chill, and settle down once more into the quiet, starlit dust, to wait for the dawn. The moon is a pale, silver witness, hanging silent over a desert that has forgotten the touch of rain. In the deep, velvet hours of the night, the North African desert undergoes a strange transformation. The blistering, golden heat of the day recedes, replaced by a cold, indigo stillness that feels as vast as the stars themselves. It is in this blue-shadowed world that the work begins, a quiet, rhythmic labor that the men have come to call, with a heavy sort of poetry, the sowing of the devil's gardens. Imagine a young man named Andreas. Before the world turned to gray and olive green, he spent his mornings in the soft, loamy soil of his family's orchard in the Rhine Valley. He knew the weight of a seed, the gentle pressure required to tuck a sapling into the earth, and the patient hope that comes with planting something intended to grow. But tonight, his hands are calloused by a different kind of harvest. He kneels in the cool, dry sand, the moonlight catching the fine dust on his knuckles. In front of him lies a heavy, circular plate of cold steel. It doesn't feel like a weapon of war in this light, it feels like a heavy, frozen secret. There is an intimacy to this work that is unlike anything else in the desert. To bury a mine is to have a private conversation with the earth itself. It is a slow, breathless dance between a man's fingers and the hidden mechanisms of a world gone wrong. Andreas breathes slowly, the air tasting of salt and ancient dust. He uses a small trowel to carve a shallow cradle in the sand. The sound is a soft, rhythmic rasp, the only noise in a world that seems to have held its breath. He works with a tenderness that is heartbreakingly misplaced. He settles the metal plate into its sandy bed, smoothing the edges, ensuring it sits perfectly level, as if he were tucking a child into sleep. There is a terrible, quiet irony in the way these men treat the earth. They move across the landscape like ghosts, bending low, their shadows stretching out long and thin across the dunes. They are gardeners of a dark sort, tending to a crop that will never bloom, but will instead wait in the silence for a footfall that may never come. Around Andreas, dozens of other young men are doing the same. They move in a slow, synchronized ballet of shadows. They do not speak. To speak would be to break the spell of the night, to invite the attention of the sky. Instead, they communicate through the soft clink of metal against stone, or the low, guttural scrape of a boot shifting in the gravel. They are tired, a bone-deep weariness that makes their movements heavy and deliberate. Many of them have letters tucked into the waistbands of their trousers, folded tightly against their skin. As Andreas works, his mind drifts to the letter he received just 3 days ago. It smelled faintly of lavender, and the ink was smudged where his sister had rested her hand. She wrote about the harvest, about how the apples were heavy on the branches this year, and how the kitchen felt too quiet without his laughter. He holds that memory in his mind like a glowing coal. It provides a strange, flickering warmth against the cold desert wind. He thinks of the apples back home, red, sweet, and bursting with life. Then he looks down at the cold, gray metal in his hands. The contrast is a sharp, silent ache in his chest. He wonders, in the secret spaces of his heart, how he will ever go back to the orchard. How can hands that have sown the seeds of the devil's gardens ever again be trusted to tend to the living? The psychological weight of the work is heavier than the steel itself. Each man knows that the garden they are creating is a labyrinth of his own making. They map the locations of these hidden traps with a desperate, meticulous care, drawing lines in their notebooks that look like the veins of a leaf. They must remember where the danger is buried, for the sake of their comrades, for the sake of their own return. But the desert is a shifting, restless thing. The wind moves the sand, erasing their footprints, blurring the landmarks they have tried so hard to memorize. There is a quiet fear that sits in the back of every man's throat, the fear that the garden will forget its master. In the middle of the night, a small moment of humanity ripples through the darkness. Andreas's friend, a quiet boy from an Italian village who misses the scent of lemons, crawls toward him through the sand. He reaches into his tunic and pulls out a small, crumpled piece of chocolate, a treasure saved from a rare ration pack. He breaks it in half with a soft snap and hands a piece to Andreas. They sit there for a few minutes, two shadows among the dunes, letting the chocolate melt slowly on their tongues. It is a tiny, fleeting sweetness in a world of salt and iron. They don't say a word. They simply lean their shoulders together for a moment, a brief acknowledgement of the fact that they are still here, still breathing, still human. In that shared silence, the devil's garden feels very far away. They are just two boys sharing a treat in the moonlight, dreaming of home. But the work must continue. The moon begins its slow descent toward the horizon, and the sky begins to bleed into a very pale, ghostly gray. The deadline is the sun. They must finish their task before the light returns and the world becomes a target once again. The rhythm resumes. Dig, place, cover, smooth. Dig, place, cover, smooth. They use their scarves and pieces of brush to sweep the sand over the buried mines, erasing any sign that the earth has been disturbed. They are masters of a deceptive peace. When they are finished, the desert floor looks as it has for thousands of years, beautiful, untouched, and indifferent. No one would ever know, looking at the rippled dunes and the scattered stones, that beneath the surface, the earth is now a tinderbox of waiting steel. As the men begin to withdraw, crawling backward toward their own lines, they feel a profound, hollow exhaustion. They have spent the night in a state of breathless tension, their senses tuned to the finest vibration, their hearts hammering against their ribs. Now that the work is done, the adrenaline fades, leaving behind a heavy, gray numbness. They look back at the ground they have just planted. Under the fading stars, it looks serene. It looks like a place where a person might walk and find peace. The realization of what they have done, the way they have turned the very ground into a betrayal, settles over them like a cold mist. It is a quiet, persistent grief for the landscape, and for their own innocence. Andreas reaches his trench just as the first sliver of pink light touches the eastern sky. He is covered in a fine, silver dust. His hands are stained with the smell of grease and cold earth. He climbs down into the shallow shelter, leaning his back against the rough, sandy wall. He pulls his sister's letter from his pocket, not to read it, he knows every word by heart, but simply to feel the texture of the paper against his fingertips. He closes his eyes, trying to envision the orchard again. He tries to see the red apples, the green leaves, and the soft, safe earth. But the image is blurry, flickering like a failing lamp. Instead, he sees the cold, circular plates of steel, waiting in the dark. The sun rises, casting long, golden shadows across the devil's gardens. The desert awakens with its usual, shimmering heat. To any observer, the world is empty and still. But the men in the trenches know better. They know that the earth is no longer just earth. It is a shared secret, a hidden weight, a garden of silence that they have sown with their own hands and watered with their own quiet, private fears. They settle into the heat of the day, drifting into a fitful, shallow sleep. They dream of rain. They dream of green grass. They dream of a world where the only thing buried in the ground is a seed, and the only thing that grows from the earth is life. And as they sleep, the desert wind sighs over the dunes, whispering over the hidden steel, waiting for the moon to return, and for the cycle of the garden to begin again. The desert has a way of breathing when the world goes still, a soft, sighing sound of wind over sand that mimics the rise and fall of 1,000 resting chests. On this particular night, the air felt different. The great, heavy heat of the day had finally surrendered to a deep, indigo chill, and the sky had opened up into a cathedral of light. High above the dunes of El Alamein, a pale, silver moon hung suspended in the void, casting a ghostly glow over the landscape. It was a light that did not discriminate. It washed over the jagged limestone ridges and the rolling waves of sand. It silvered the rusted hulls of abandoned trucks and the sharp, jagged edges of the barbed wire. And most gently, it touched the faces of the thousands of men who lay tucked into the earth, waiting for a dawn that would change everything. There was a silence on this eve that was more than just the absence of noise. It was a living thing, a profound and heavy hush that seemed to press down on the trenches like a soft, woolen blanket. The usual sounds of the camp, the distant clatter of a mess tin, the low hum of an engine, the sharp bark of a command, had all faded away into a singular, collective holding of breath. If you were to walk along the lines in the moonlight, you would not see an army of soldiers preparing for a struggle. You would see a landscape of dreamers, each one marooned on his own tiny island of memory. In one shallow trench, a young man named William lay on his back, his head resting on his kit bag. His eyes were wide, reflecting the brilliant dusting of the Milky Way. In his hand, he held a small, rectangular piece of card, its edges softened and frayed by weeks of being pressed against his heart. It was a photograph of a girl standing in a sun-drenched garden, her hair caught in a breeze that had blown a lifetime ago in a world far, far away. In the silver light of the moon, he traced the outline of her face with a thumb that was stained with the dust of the desert. He wasn't thinking of the maps or the orders he had been given. He was thinking of the way the air smelled after a spring rain in his village, and the way her hand felt, small and warm, in his. He whispered her name into the cool night air, a tiny, private prayer sent out into the vastness of the Sahara, hoping that somehow, the wind might carry it across the sea. Just a few miles away, across the silent and lethal expanse of the minefields, another man sat in a hole carved into the rock. His name was Heinrich, and he was many years older than William, with lines etched deep into the corners of his eyes by the relentless sun. He was not looking at a photograph. Instead, he was looking at the moon. He remembered his wife telling him once, years ago, that no matter how far apart they were, they would always be looking at the same moon. It was a simple thought, a childhood comfort, but in the eerie stillness of El Alamein, it felt like a lifeline. He imagined her sleeping in their quiet bedroom, the moonlight streaming through the window and pooling on the floor. He closed his eyes and tried to match his breathing to the rhythm he remembered of her sleep. For a few precious minutes, the desert disappeared. The smell of hot metal and dry earth was replaced by the phantom scent of lavender and clean linen. He was not a soldier in a forgotten corner of Africa. He was a husband, resting beside his love, safe in the sanctuary of home. This was the secret of the moonlit breath. In the dark, the uniforms lost their color. The ideologies that had brought them to this patch of sand faded into the shadows. What remained were the things that made them human, the love, the longing, the quiet, trembling fear that they kept hidden from their comrades during the day. Along the Allied lines, the silence was occasionally broken by a soft, rhythmic clicking. It was the sound of men checking their gear one last time, not with a sense of urgency, but with a slow, meditative care. They ran their fingers over the cold steel of their rifles, feeling the familiar notches and scratches. They adjusted the straps of their helmets. They shared cigarettes in the dark, the small, glowing cherries of light appearing and disappearing like fireflies. When they spoke, it was in whispers, voices low and melodic, talking of things that had nothing to do with the coming day. They talked of the best places to catch trout in the mountain streams of New Zealand. They argued softly about the merits of different types of beer in the pubs of London. They shared memories of the taste of a mother's Sunday roast. These stories were their armor, a way to wrap themselves in the familiar before stepping into the unknown. There was a profound kindness in the way the men treated one another in these final, quiet hours. A seasoned sergeant might lean over and gently tuck a blanket around a shivering younger soldier who had fallen into a fitful sleep. A boy might offer his last precious piece of chocolate to a friend, a silent gesture of brotherhood that carried more weight than any medal. They looked out for one another with a tender, watchful eye, knowing that the man sitting next to them in the dirt was the only piece of family they had in this desolate world. Up on the ridges, the wind began to pick up, a soft, mournful whistle that played through the limestone caves. It carried the scent of the sea, a faint, salty promise of a world beyond the sand. The men breathed it in deeply, letting the cool air soothe their parched throats. They looked up at the stars, those ancient and different witnesses to 1,000 human sorrows. There is a strange comfort in the stars when you are far from home. They are the only thing that remains the same. The same constellations that guided the ancient travelers across the desert were now watching over these boys from every corner of the globe. It was as if the sky were a giant mirror, reflecting the hopes and fears of every soul resting on the earth below. In the German and Italian camps, the feeling was the same, a heavy, thoughtful waiting. They were tired, their bodies worn thin by the lack of water and the constant, grinding presence of the dust. But in the moonlight, even the most exhausted man found a moment of resilience. They sat in small groups, leaning against the cold metal of their tanks, watching the shadows stretch and dance across the dunes. They thought of the letters they had sent, wondering if the words they had written would be the last ones their families would ever read. They whispered prayers, some to a God they had long forgotten, others to the memory of their fathers. They weren't praying for victory, they were praying for the strength to be brave, and for the safety of the men standing to their left and their right. A young Italian soldier, barely 20 years old, found a small, smooth stone in the bottom of his trench. He polished it against his sleeve until it shone like a dark pearl in the moonlight. He closed his eyes and imagined it was a lucky charm, a piece of the earth that would protect him. He thought of his mother's kitchen in Sicily, the sound of her voice singing as she prepared the evening meal. He could almost hear the clatter of the plates and the laughter of his younger brothers. He held the stone tightly in his palm, a tiny piece of reality to hold onto in a world that felt increasingly like a dream. The moon began its slow, inevitable descent toward the horizon, its light softening from silver to a pale, bruised cream. The shadows grew longer, reaching out across the sand like dark fingers. The air grew even colder, a sharp, biting frost that made the men huddle closer together for warmth. They knew the time was drawing near. They could feel the tension tightening in the air, a physical pressure that made their hearts beat a little faster against their ribs. But still, the silence held. It was a sacred interval, a moment of grace granted by the desert before the storm. It was a time for one last look at a photograph, one last whispered name, one last deep breath of the cool, night air. In this hour, the men of El Alamein were not enemies, they were a single, vast community of human beings, all sharing the same moon, the same stars, and the same quiet, moonlit breath. They lay there in the silver dark, thousands of heartbeats thudding softly against the ancient sand. There were boys who wanted to be men, and men who wanted to be boys again, safe in their beds at home. There were poets and farmers, sons and husbands, all bound together by the strange and terrible gravity of history. And as the first hint of gray began to bleed into the eastern sky, signaling the end of the night, they held onto the silence for as long as they could. They breathed in the stillness. They breathed in the memory of home. They breathed in the silver light of the moon. And then, with a quiet, collective sigh that seemed to ripple across the entire desert, they prepared themselves to face the light. The moon faded, becoming a pale, translucent ghost in the sky. The stars began to wink out, one by one, as the world turned toward the sun. The long, silver night of El Alamein was over, and the moonlit breath was replaced by the steady, rhythmic pulse of an army waking up. But for those who were there, the memory of that silence would remain, a quiet, silver secret buried deep beneath the sand, a reminder of a moment when the world was still, and every man was a brother under the watchful eye of the moon. The night did not end with a sunrise, but with a sudden, artificial day that tore the darkness in two. For hours, the silence had been a heavy, velvet curtain draped over the desert, but at a single, unseen signal, that curtain was shredded by 1,000 points of light. Imagine sitting in the deep, cool bottom of a narrow trench, your back pressed against the gritty, sun-warmed earth. You have spent the last few hours listening to the gentle rhythm of your own breath and the soft, distant whistle of the wind. Then, in an instant, the world is no longer dark. The sky above your head is not the deep indigo you have come to know, but a frantic, pulsing kaleidoscope of orange, crimson, and blinding white. It is as if the heavens have caught fire, and the stars have all fallen at once to the horizon. Arthur sat in the shadows of his small dugout, his knees pulled tight against his chest. He was a young man who, only a year ago, had spent his evenings watching the slow, golden light of the hearth in a small cottage in the north of England. He knew the soft crackle of burning wood and the way a candle flame dances in a drafty room. But this light was different. This was a light that didn't just illuminate the world, it seemed to vibrate through his very bones. Each flash from the distant horizon sent a low, humming thrum through the sand, a heartbeat of the earth itself that he felt in his teeth and in the tips of his fingers. To an observer from a great distance, it might have looked like a grand, spectacular display, a silent lightning storm moving across the sand. But for Arthur, tucked into the belly of the desert, the world had become very small and very intense. The air began to smell of sharp, bitter sulfur and the metallic tang of heated iron. The fine dust that usually settled quietly on his boots was now dancing, suspended in the air by the constant, rhythmic pulsing of the ground. In this moment of overwhelming noise and light, a strange thing happened. Arthur felt a profound, unexpected sense of loneliness. It is a paradox of the human spirit that in the middle of a crowd, amidst the shared experience of thousands, one can feel entirely, singularly alone. The roar of the horizon was so vast that it seemed to drown out the very idea of other people. He felt like a single grain of sand being tossed in a great, blowing gale. He closed his eyes, trying to find the stars again in his mind, trying to remember the cool, quiet dark of the hour before. But then, he felt a touch. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply the weight of a hand resting on his forearm. To his left sat Jack, a man 10 years his senior who had once been a gardener in a quiet coastal town. Jack didn't say anything. There were no words that could pierce the heavy, thrumming air, and perhaps there were no words needed. Jack simply reached out in the flickering, orange light and gripped Arthur's sleeve. It was a small, quiet anchor in a world that had lost its moorings. Arthur looked over and saw Jack's face, illuminated by a sudden, bright flash of white. Jack wasn't looking at the sky, he was looking at the small, wooden carving he held in his other hand, a tiny, rough bird he had been working on for days. He looked calm, his eyes soft and focused on the simple lines of the wood. In that glance, Arthur felt the loneliness begin to recede. He realized that the man next to him was traveling through the same fire, feeling the same tremors, and clutching his own memories of home. Arthur reached out and placed his hand over Jack's. The skin was rough and calloused, smelling faintly of the oil they used to clean their equipment, but it was warm. It was alive. In the middle of a desert that seemed determined to turn into a furnace, that simple warmth was the most important thing in the world. They sat there together, two human beings holding onto one another in the dark, finding a strange, beautiful solace in their shared silence. The barrage continued, a relentless, rhythmic drumming that seemed to stretch time into something unrecognizable. Arthur found himself drifting, his mind wandering away from the flickering sky and back to the world he loved. The flashes of white light above him began to remind him of the summer lightning he used to watch from his bedroom window as a child. He remembered the way the rain would smell just before the clouds broke, a clean, wet scent that promised life. He imagined he could hear the soft patter of droplets on the leaves of the oak tree outside his home, a sound so gentle it was like a lullaby. He thought of the letters he had written, those fragile pieces of paper now traveling across the sea. He hoped the people reading them would never have to know this light. He hoped they would only ever know the soft, warm glow of a lamp or the gentle shimmer of a summer afternoon. He made a quiet promise to himself, a whispered vow in the depths of his heart, that if he ever saw the green fields of home again, he would never take the silence for granted. He would cherish every quiet shadow and every undisturbed night. The ground continued to shiver, a constant, low-frequency hum that felt like a purr from a giant, hidden cat. It was strange how the human mind can adapt. After a while, the noise didn't seem like noise anymore. It became the environment, a heavy, sonic fog that he navigated with his thoughts. He watched the way the light played across the walls of his trench. The shadows danced in frantic, jagged shapes, turning the familiar piles of sandbags into strange, shifting monuments. He noticed a small beetle, no larger than a fingernail, struggling to climb a slope of loose sand near his boot. Even as the earth shook and the sky burned, this tiny creature was determined to keep moving, its little legs working tirelessly against the shifting grains. Arthur watched it with a sense of wonder. The world was ending in a storm of iron and fire, and yet, life was still there, small and stubborn and resilient. He reached out with a piece of straw and gently helped the beetle over a difficult ridge. It was a tiny act of kindness, a moment of gentleness in a night of violence, and it made him feel a little more like himself. The paradox of the moment was profound. He was surrounded by the most intense display of power humanity could conjure, yet all his attention was focused on the warmth of a hand, the memory of rain, and the journey of a small beetle. It was as if the louder the world became, the more the heart sought out the quiet things. Jack nudged him gently, leaning closer so his voice could be heard as a soft murmur against Arthur's ear. "Nearly dawn, son," Jack whispered. Arthur nodded. He could see the first faint hint of real light beginning to bleed into the eastern sky, a soft, dusty rose that looked fragile against the violent orange of the horizon. The barrage was not slowing down, but the coming of the sun felt like a promise that the night would eventually have to end. He squeezed Jack's hand one more time before they both began to prepare for what the day would bring. They moved with a slow, meditative grace, checking their belts and smoothing the fabric of their tunics. The fear was still there, of course, a cold, quiet weight in the pit of the stomach, but it was no longer a frantic thing. It had been tempered by the hours of waiting and by the simple presence of another person. They were no longer just individuals lost in the dark. They were part of a quiet, resilient chain of humanity that stretched across the dunes. The sky above El Alamein remained a canvas of fire, but beneath it, in the shadowed corners of the earth, the men were finding their own ways to stay whole. They were breathing in the sulphurous air and breathing out prayers. They were looking at the flames and seeing the hearths of their childhoods. They were huddled in the dark, but they were holding onto the light of one another. As the sun finally began to pull itself over the edge of the world, turning the sand from gray to gold, Arthur took one last deep breath. He felt the weight of the hand on his arm and the memory of the beetle on the straw. He looked at the horizon, where the fire and the dawn met in a confusing, beautiful blur. The world was waking up to a struggle, but for this moment, in the lingering echoes of the barrage, he felt a strange, hushed peace. He was here. He was alive. And he was not alone. The fire in the sky would eventually fade, leaving only the sun and the sand, but the quiet bonds forged in the heat of that night would remain, buried like secrets beneath the desert floor. Arthur closed his eyes for a heartbeat, savoring the warmth of the rising sun on his face, and then he stood up to meet the day. The world becomes very small when it is measured by the length of a single bayonet blade. While the sky above El Alamein was still a bruised canvas of flickering oranges and reds, there was a different kind of war being waged down in the dirt, far beneath the reach of the soaring light. It was a war of absolute stillness, of held breath, and of a courage so quiet it felt almost like a prayer. Here, on the edge of the vast, unseen minefields, the noise of the great barrage began to recede into a dull, rhythmic thrumming, like the heartbeat of a giant sleeping far underground. For the men known as the sappers, the horizon did not matter. The grand strategy of generals did not matter. All that mattered was the 3 feet of sand directly in front of their eyes. Imagine a young man named Thomas. Just 2 years ago, Thomas spent his days in a sun-drenched workshop in a small town in Kent, repairing the delicate innards of pocket watches. He was a man of fine movements, of steady hands and infinite patience. He understood the language of tiny springs and microscopic gears. Now, he finds himself in the middle of a desert night, his world reduced to the cold steel of a bayonet and the shifting, treacherous grains of the North African sand. He is lying on his stomach, his chest pressed against the cooling earth. The sand is no longer a golden playground, it is a shroud, a veil drawn over 1,000 hidden secrets. He moves forward not with a leap or run, but with a slow, agonizing inching of his body. He is a shadow among shadows, his breathing shallow and controlled, as if even a deep exhale might disturb the balance of the world. In his right hand, he holds his bayonet. He does not use it as a weapon tonight, but as a needle, a probe, a gentle finger reaching into the dark. He pushes the blade into the sand at a shallow angle, a soft, rhythmic motion he has practiced until his muscles remember it better than his own name. Push. Withdraw. Move. Push. Withdraw. Move. The earth here is a jigsaw puzzle of life and death. Every time the metal blade slides into the grit, Thomas feels a tiny jolt of electricity run up his arm. Most of the time, the blade meets only the soft resistance of the sand or the dull thud of a buried stone. But sometimes, there is a different sensation. A soft, metallic clink. A sudden, cold resistance that feels unlike anything else in nature. In those moments, the world stops turning. Thomas freezes. He can feel the sweat prickling at his hairline, despite the midnight chill. He can feel his heart hammering against the ribs that are pressed so tightly into the dust. He doesn't move a muscle. He waits. He listens to the silence. He thinks of the watch shop, the smell of linseed oil and the ticking of 100 clocks, all marking time in a world that made sense. He uses that memory to steady his hand. Slowly, with a tenderness that a mother might use to brush a hair from a sleeping child's forehead, he begins to brush away the top layer of sand with his bare fingers. He doesn't use a shovel. He doesn't use a brush. Only the soft, sensitive pads of his fingertips. He feels the cold, rusted edge of a steel plate. He feels the tiny, delicate prongs of a fuse, standing like a silver hair in the moonlight. He is so close now that he can smell the faint, bitter scent of the explosive, mixed with the metallic tang of the casing. He is a gardener in the devil's garden, and he is performing a dark, delicate surgery. He works by touch alone, his eyes useless in the deep shadows of the pit he has uncovered. He finds the safety pin, a tiny piece of wire that stands between him and the end of his story. With a breath he didn't know he was holding, he slides the pin home. The mine is still there, but it is asleep. It is no longer a threat. It is just a piece of scrap metal in a vast, empty desert. Thomas leans his forehead against the sand for a fleeting second, allowing the adrenaline to wash out of his limbs like a retreating tide. He is exhausted, a bone-deep weariness that makes his fingers ache and his eyes burn. But he cannot stop. Behind him, in the dark, are his friends. There is Jack, who shared his last cigarette an hour ago. There is Peter, who talked about his newborn daughter until his voice cracked. There is a whole army of boys waiting for him to finish his slow, rhythmic dance with the earth. If he misses just one, the path he is clearing becomes a trap. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out a roll of white cotton tape. He pegs the end into the sand and begins to unroll it behind him as he moves forward. This tape is a lifeline. In the chaos of the coming hours, it will be the only safe road through the valley of sleep. To the men who will follow, that thin strip of white cloth will look like a river of silver, a promise of a future, a way home. As he inches forward, Thomas feels a hand touch his boot. It is the sapper behind him, a quiet signal that they are still together, still a chain of living souls in the void. They don't speak. They don't need to. The touch is enough. It is a reminder that even in the most solitary of tasks, no man is truly alone. They are a brotherhood of the slow crawl, a family defined by the courage it takes to move 6 inches at a time. Thomas thinks about the letters he has in his tunic. He wonders if the people at home can imagine this silence. They see the headlines, they hear the roar of the newsreels, but they don't know about the sound of a fingernail scraping against a rusted fuse. They don't know about the way the moonlight catches the dust on a man's knuckles as he tries to save a world he can't see. He remembers a letter from his father, a man who fought in a different war, in a different mud-soaked land. Patience is the only thing that will bring you home, his father had written. Thomas hadn't understood it then, but he understands it now. Survival isn't always about the grand gesture, sometimes it is simply about the refusal to be hurried. It is about the resilience of the spirit that can look at 1,000 yards of lethal sand and decide to face it one bayonet length at a time. The hours stretch and blur. The moon begins its long, slow descent toward the western horizon, turning from silver to a dull, heavy gold. The air grows sharper, colder, biting at the exposed skin of his neck. Thomas's knees are raw, the fabric of his trousers worn through by the constant friction of the grit. His hands are numb, and his mind is beginning to drift into the hazy, dangerous territory of fatigue. He finds another mine. This one is smaller, a silent one that hides deep in the belly of the dune. He repeats the process. Dig. Brush. Pin. Tape. It is a meditation. It is a ritual. He has lost track of how many he has neutralized. He has lost track of time itself. He is only the movement of the blade and the feeling of the sand. A faint, pale light begins to touch the very edge of the world. It is not yet the sun, but the ghost of the sun, a graying of the dark that makes the dunes look like frozen waves on a dead sea. Thomas looks back. Behind him, the white tape stretches away into the gloom, a straight, unwavering line of hope. It looks beautiful. It is the only thing he has created in this wasteland, and it is a masterpiece. He sees the shapes of the infantry beginning to stir in the distance. They are getting ready to use the road he has built for them. He feels a sudden, sharp pang of affection for these men he barely knows. He wants to stand up and tell them to be careful, to watch their step, to remember that the path is narrow. But he simply continues his work. The heroism of the sapper is a lonely thing. There are no cheering crowds here, no banners flying. There is only the quiet satisfaction of a job done with a steady hand. Thomas knows that if he does his job perfectly, no one will ever know his name. The tanks will roll over his path, the men will march through his lane, and they will only notice the road if it fails them. And that is enough for him. To be the invisible bridge between the dark and the light is a noble thing. He reaches the end of the designated sector. He hammers in the final peg and ties off the tape. He rolls onto his back, staring up at the fading stars. His chest is heaving, his muscles are trembling with a violent, uncontrollable fatigue, but his heart is quiet. He has walked through the dark, and he has brought the light with him. The first real ray of the sun hits the top of a distant dune, turning the sand into a sudden, brilliant gold. Thomas closes his eyes, feeling the warmth on his eyelids. He smells the faint, dusty scent of the desert morning. He has survived the night. He has cleared the way. He reaches out and touches the white tape one last time, a silent goodbye to the road he has built. Then, he begins to crawl back toward his own lines, moving with the same slow, deliberate care, a quiet hero returning from a very long walk in the dark. The desert wind picks up, a gentle, morning breeze that rustles the edges of the white tape. It whispers over the empty pits and the neutralized steel, a soft song for the men who spent the night on their knees so that others might stand. The sun rises higher, the shadows retreat, and the road to El Alamein lies open, marked in silver, waiting for the feet of the brave. Inside the belly of the great iron beast, the world is reduced to the size of a heartbeat and the scent of warm oil. While the desert outside is a vast, unmapped ocean of light and wind, for the 4 men within the steel walls of a tank, the universe has shrunk. It is a world made of rivets and gears, of heavy grease and the constant, rhythmic thrumming of a metal heart. Here, the horizon is a narrow slit of glass, and the sun is a silent enemy that turns their sanctuary into a slow, golden oven. Close your eyes and imagine the air inside this steel cage. It is thick and heavy, tasting of diesel fumes and the salt of human sweat. It is a warmth that doesn't just sit on the skin, it wraps around you like a heavy, woolen blanket, pressing against your chest with every breath. To the men who live here, this heat is not a hardship to be fought, but a constant companion to be endured, a shared burden that binds them closer than brothers. In the driver's seat, tucked low in the front of the machine, sits Leo. He is a young man with well-stained hands and eyes that have grown used to reading the desert through a tiny, dusty viewblock. His world is the vibration of the steering levers and the low, steady song of the engine. To anyone else, the noise would be deafening, a mechanical roar that drowns out the soul. But to Leo, it is a lullaby. He knows the exact pitch of a healthy gear, he can feel the subtle change in the engine's breath when the sand begins to clog the filters. He drives with a gentle touch, navigating the dunes as if he were steering a boat through a quiet harbor. He feels the tank heave and sway, a slow, metallic rocking that mimics the motion of a cradle. In the dark, cramped space of his cabin, he has taped a small, black and white photograph of his mother to the dashboard. Her smile is a little blurred by the vibration, but it is the first thing he looks at when the sun begins to rise, and the last thing he sees before the hatches are closed for the night. Just behind him, in the turret, is Peter. Peter is the loader, the man who moves with a practiced, rhythmic grace in a space no larger than a kitchen cupboard. His job is heavy and constant, but he does it with a quiet, meditative focus. He handles the heavy steel shells with the same care a baker might handle a loaf of bread. In the pauses between their slow, lumbering movements across the sand, Peter reaches into a small, hidden crevice in the turret wall. He pulls out a single, crumpled peppermint sweet, wrapped in a bit of wax paper. It is a tiny, precious treasure he has been saving for 3 days. He carefully unwraps it, the small crinkle of the paper loud in the mechanical hum of the tank. He doesn't eat it himself. He reaches out a grimy hand and taps Leo on the shoulder. Without a word, he drops the sweet into Leo's palm. Leo looks back, his face smeared with grease and a pale dusting of sand. He offers a small, tired smile, a brief flash of white teeth in the gloom. He pops the peppermint into his mouth, and for a few minutes, the sharp, cool taste of mint washes away the metallic tang of the oil. It is a moment of pure, unadulterated kindness, a small sweetness shared in a world made of iron. They don't need to speak. In the steel cage, a touch or a shared sweet says more than 1,000 grand speeches. The heat continues to build as the sun climbs higher over El Alamein. The metal of the hull becomes too hot to touch with a bare hand. The men learn to move with a strange, liquid caution, avoiding the scalding surfaces, their movements synchronized like the parts of a clock. They have become part of the machine, and the machine has become part of them. They speak in a private language of headsets and microphones, their voices thin and crackling over the static. But even through the wires, the tone is always calm. The commander, sitting high in the turret, speaks to them not as soldiers, but as family. He tells them of the terrain ahead, describing the ripples of the sand as if he were reading a storybook. He reminds them to drink from their warm, metallic-tasting canteens. He tells them jokes about the food they will eat when the world is quiet again, painting vivid pictures of roasted meats and cool, garden-fresh vegetables. Beneath the headsets, each man is also living in a world of his own making. In the suffocating stillness of the midday halt, when the engine is cut and the only sound is the ticking of the cooling metal, they fall into a shallow, heavy sleep. Peter leans his head against the cold steel of the ammunition rack. In his mind, he is not in North Africa. He is back in his father's workshop, the air smelling of fresh cedar shavings and the cool, damp earth of the forest. He can hear the soft rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird. The vibration of the tank becomes the rhythmic swing of a hammer, the smell of the diesel becomes the scent of pine resin. He clings to these memories with a quiet, desperate resilience, using them to build a wall against the vast and different desert outside. The brotherhood in a tank crew is a strange and beautiful thing. It is forged in the absence of privacy and the presence of shared fear. They know the sound of each other's breathing. They know the specific way each man sighs when he is thinking of home. They have seen each other at their most vulnerable, huddled together in the dark during the long, cold nights, sharing blankets and stories to keep the shadows at bay. There is an intimacy here that the infantry, scattered across the wide trenches, can never truly know. In the tank, there is no I, only we. If the driver is tired, the whole beast stumbles. If the loader is slow, the whole heart of the machine falters. They are a single organism, a four-headed creature of steel and soul, navigating the fire together. Imagine a moment when the world outside the hull begins to tremble. The distant thud of artillery makes the sand dance on the floor plates. Inside, the men don't move. They don't panic. They simply reach out and touch the surfaces of their cage. It is their armor, their house, their only protection against the storm. They find a strange comfort in the thickness of the steel. It is a prison, yes, but it is also a sanctuary. Leo grips the steering levers a little tighter. He feels the presence of Peter behind him and the commander above him. He feels the weight of their lives resting in his hands, and instead of being crushed by it, he feels a surge of quiet, everyday heroism. He will keep them moving. He will find the path through the dust. He will be the steady hand that guides them home. As the afternoon light begins to soften, turning the interior of the tank into a cathedral of long, dusty shadows, the men prepare for the evening. They pull out their letters, the fragile, sweat-stained papers that have traveled so far to reach them. They read the words silently, their lips moving as they savor the names of sisters, wives, and children. One man might read a sentence aloud, a small piece of news about a neighbor's dog or a successful harvest, and the others will nod, taking in the information as if it were their own. In the steel cage, every memory is shared property. They share the last of their water, passing the canteen from hand to hand. The water is warm and tastes of the metal tank, but they drink it with a slow, reverent gratitude. They wipe their faces with rags that are more oil than cloth, leaving streaks of clean skin that soon disappear under a new layer of dust. Outside, the sun begins to sink toward the horizon, painting the desert in hues of violet and deep orange. The heat inside the tank finally begins to ebb, replaced by a lingering, dry warmth that radiates from the metal walls. The men prepare for the night, checking the hatches and securing the equipment. They will spend the night inside, curled in the small, cramped spaces between the machinery. It is not a comfortable rest, but it is a safe one. They will sleep to the sound of each other's snoring and the soft, metallic clinking of the tank as it settles into the sand. Before he closes his eyes, Leo looks once more at the photograph on his dashboard. He thinks of the peppermint and the touch on his shoulder. He thinks of the way Peter moved in the turret and the way the commander's voice sounded over the static. He feels a profound, quiet peace. They are still here. They are still together. The steel cage is hot, and it is small, and the world outside is a terrifying mystery, but inside, there is a brotherhood that no fire can touch. They are the boys of the Iron Beast, the dreamers in the steel cage. They breathe in the scent of oil and breathe out the names of the ones they love. And as the desert night wraps its cold arms around the hull of their tank, they drift into a sleep filled with the green fields and cool rains of a world they are determined to see again. The great iron heart of the machine is quiet now, resting in the starlight, waiting for the dawn to turn the steel back into an oven and the boys back into heroes. But for now, in the silence of the dunes, they are just four friends, safe in their metal home, dreaming of the day the hatches will open for the very last time. Somewhere in the quiet heart of the mountains, a telephone began to ring, and a dream of peace was quietly shattered. The mountains of Europe are painted in shades of deep green and slate gray, a world of mist, of cool, falling water, and the scent of damp pine. Here, in a quiet hospital room far from the roar of the guns, Erwin Rommel sat by a window. For a few brief, flickering weeks, the legendary figure of the desert had been replaced by a tired man wrapped in a heavy wool robe, watching the clouds drift over the peaks. The air here was sweet and thin, tasting of nothing but rain and altitude. The desert, with its biting salt and its blinding, yellow heat, felt like a nightmare from a different life. He was thin, so thin that his skin seemed translucent in the soft European light. The illness he had carried out of Africa had been a persistent, hollow ache that had drained the strength from his limbs and the fire from his eyes. In the quiet of the recovery ward, he had slowly begun to remember the small, beautiful things he had forgotten in the dust. He remembered the weight of a real ceramic mug of coffee, the way the grass feels beneath bare feet in the morning, and the profound, healing silence of a night without the thrum of an engine. He was a husband again. He was a father. He was a man who could close his eyes and not see the shimmer of a heat mirage. But the telephone does not care for the recovery of the soul. When the news came, the news of the great storm breaking at El Alamein, it didn't arrive as a grand proclamation. It was a series of frantic, crackling whispers over the wire, a story of lines breaking and water running dry. As he listened, the cool mountain air seemed to vanish, replaced by the ghost of a hot wind against his cheek. He looked down at his hands, those steady, calloused hands that had spent a lifetime reading maps and steering through the unknown, and he felt a deep, sinking ache in his chest. It wasn't the return of his illness, it was the return of the weight. He knew what was happening. He could see it as clearly as if he were standing on a limestone ridge, looking out over the dunes. He saw the exhausted boys in the trenches. He saw the empty fuel barrels and the tired horses. He saw the faces of the men who had followed him across 1,000 miles of sand, men who believed that as long as he was there, they could endure anything. Leaving the mountains was not an act of military ambition. It was a quiet, heartbreaking sacrifice. Imagine the moment he had to say goodbye to his wife, Lucy. The house was warm, the fire was low, and the world outside was safe and still. To step out of that door, to trade the soft light of home for the blinding glare of the desert, felt like walking into a gray, cold shadow. There were no cameras there, no cheering crowds. There was only a man in a coat, holding his wife's hand for 1 second longer than he should, breathing in the scent of home one last time. He didn't want the desert. He didn't want the fox's mantle. He wanted to stay in the green hills and listen to the rain. But he also knew that he could not leave his family of soldiers to face the dark alone. The journey back was a slow, meditative transition from life to the void. As the plane rose over the Alps, the world below was a tapestry of civilization, towns and villages, steeples and farms. But as they flew south, the colors began to bleed away. The deep greens turned to the pale blues of the Mediterranean, and the blue eventually surrendered to the harsh, uncompromising gold of the African coast. From the small window of the aircraft, Rommel watched the transformation with a heavy heart. He was moving toward a place where time stood still, where the only thing that grew was the heat. He spent the hours of the flight not looking at reports, but writing. His fountain pen moved slowly across the paper, the ink a dark, steady line in a world of turbulence. He wrote to Lucy, his words soft and poetic, filled with a longing that he could never show to his officers. He told her how the sea looked from the air, like a piece of crumpled silk. He told her that he carried the memory of their garden with him like a lucky charm. He didn't write about victory. He wrote about the way the light had looked on the mountains before he left. As the plane descended toward the dusty airstrip, the heat began to seep through the fuselage. It was a physical presence, a dry, suffocating breath that tasted of salt and old iron. When the door opened and the desert wind rushed in, it was like the closing of a trap. He stepped out onto the tarmac, and for a moment, the horizon spun. The glare was a physical blow to his tired eyes. The dust immediately found the creases of his uniform, coating him in the gray-yellow powder that had become his second skin. He looked at the men waiting for him. They were his officers, his friends, but they looked like ghosts. Their eyes were sunken and shadowed, their skin stretched tight over their cheekbones. When they saw him, a ripple of something like hope passed over their faces, a fragile, beautiful, and terrifying thing. They looked at him as if he were a miracle, as if his mere presence could turn the sand into water and the shells into dust. And that was the greatest burden of all. As he was driven toward his headquarters, Rommel looked out at the vast, indifferent expanse of the desert. He saw the columns of dust on the horizon, the rhythmic flashes of distant guns. He felt the vibration of the earth through the floor of the car. He knew, with a certainty that sat like lead in his stomach, that the situation was beyond repair. He was a father returning to a house that was already on fire, not to put it out, but simply to be there when the roof fell in. He thought of the thousands of young men out there in the dunes, the boys who were even now writing their own letters home by the light of a guttering candle. He thought of their private fears, the way they huddled in the dark, the way they shared their last sips of brackish water. They were his responsibility, his children of the sand. He felt a profound, quiet grief for them. He knew he had come back to lead them through the hardest days of their lives, and that for many of them, there would be no return to the green hills and the cool rain. That evening, he sat in his command trailer, a small, metal box that hummed with the heat of the day. A single lamp cast long, flickering shadows against the maps on the wall. Outside, the desert was finding its nighttime chill, the wind sighing through the camouflage netting. He was exhausted. His head throbbed with the return of the pressure, and his body felt fragile and old. A young aide-de-camp entered, bringing a cup of tea. The boy was barely 20, his uniform several sizes too large for his thin frame. He placed the cup on the table with a hand that trembled ever so slightly. Rommel looked up and saw the boy's eyes, wide, searching, and filled with a desperate need for reassurance. "Thank you," Rommel whispered, his voice soft and raspy from the dust. He reached out and placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. It was a simple, human gesture, but in the middle of that vast, dark wasteland, it meant everything. For a moment, the war disappeared. There was no strategy, no empire, no retreating lines. There was only an older man and a younger man, two souls caught in the same storm, finding a moment of quiet connection in the dark. "Try to get some sleep tonight," Rommel said gently. "The stars are bright. It will be a cold night. Keep your blanket close." The boy nodded, a small, grateful smile touching his lips, and he slipped out into the night. Rommel watched him go, then turned back to his maps. But he didn't see the lines or the arrows. He saw the faces of all the boys like that one, thousands of them, stretching out across the desert, waiting for him to tell them what to do. He picked up his pen and finished his letter to Lucy. I am here, he wrote. The sand is as I remembered it. The wind is cold tonight. I find myself thinking of the way the mist sits in the valleys at home. Do not worry for me, my dearest. I am where I must be. I am with my men. He folded the paper and tucked it away. He knew the coming days would be a long, slow unraveling. He knew the glory was gone, and only the endurance remained. But as he listened to the soft, rhythmic sighing of the desert wind, he felt a strange, quiet peace. He was no longer a legend in a newsreel. He was a man who had chosen to return to the fire so that his family would not have to face the dark alone. He blew out the lamp, and the shadows of the trailer swallowed him whole. Outside, the moon rose over El Alamein, silvering the dunes and the tanks and the sleeping soldiers. The desert fox was back in the sand, a tired father watching over a world he knew he could not save, breathing in the cold, night air and waiting for the dawn. Time in the desert does not run like a river, it settles like the dust, heavy and unmoving, until the days and nights blur into a single, shimmering dream of exhaustion. As the great struggle at El Alamein entered its middle heart, the world seemed to hold its breath. The grand movements of armies, the sweeping arrows on the generals' maps, and the thunderous charges of the early days had slowed into something much more intimate and much more weary. It became a stalemate of the spirit, a long, grinding interval where the lines on the sand barely moved, but the men within those lines were changed forever by the sheer weight of the waiting. Close your eyes and imagine the heat of the 10th day. It is a heat that no longer feels like a temperature, but like a physical presence sitting on your shoulders. The air is thick with the scent of wood smoke from small tea fires, the sharp tang of petrol, and the ever-present, salt-sweet smell of the sea, mocking the parched throats of the men in the dunes. In the trenches, the world has shrunk to the length of a shadow. There is a young man named Elias. He comes from a valley in Wales where the rain is a constant, silver curtain and the moss grows thick and soft over the stones. Out here, under the white-hot eye of the African sun, Elias has forgotten what it feels like to be damp. His skin is the color of the earth, his lips are etched with fine white lines of salt, and his eyes have a distant, hazy look, the look of a man who has seen too much of the horizon. He sits in the bottom of a shallow slit trench, his back against the cooling sand as the sun begins its slow, painful descent. In his lap is a small, battered tin of bully beef, but he isn't eating. He is watching a tiny, iridescent beetle laboring its way up a steep slope of loose grit. He watches it with a focus that is almost holy. In a world of steel and fire, the survival of this small, fragile life feels like the most important thing in the universe. He reaches out a calloused finger and gently nudges a stray pebble out of the beetle's path. Go on then, he whispers, his voice a dry rasp. At least one of us should get somewhere today. His friend, a boy named Arthur who used to work in a library, leans his head back and chuckles softly. The sound is like dry leaves skittering over pavement. They have sat in this hole for days. They have shared every secret, every fear, and every crumb of their meager rations. They know the rhythm of each other's breathing. They know the names of the sisters and the sweethearts waiting in the rain-washed streets of home. They have become a single soul, divided between two tired bodies, anchored to the earth by the simple, beautiful fact that they are not alone. Across the valley of sand, beyond the wire and the hidden gardens of steel, there is another trench. And in that trench sits a man named Lucas. Lucas is older, a man who once spent his autumns tending to the vineyards of the Rhine. He is just as tired as Elias. He is just as thirsty. The same flies that plagued the British lines are humming around his head, the same dust is in his teeth. Lucas pulls a crumpled letter from his tunic. It is stained with the sweat of his own body, the ink beginning to fade. He doesn't need to read the words, he knows them by heart. His wife writes of the grapes, how they are heavy and sweet this year, and how the air in the evenings is turning crisp and cold. He closes his eyes and tries to conjure that cold air. He tries to feel the damp mist on his face. In this long, grinding stalemate, the enemy is no longer a monster or a ghost. The enemy is the sun. The enemy is the thirst. The enemy is the infinite, crushing boredom that threatens to swallow the mind. There are hours, sometimes whole afternoons, when the firing stops entirely. The desert is too hot for anger. The men on both sides simply collapse into the shadows of their dugouts, their rifles resting untouched, their hearts beating in a slow, rhythmic truce of exhaustion. During these hushed intervals, a strange and quiet humanity ripples across the lines. A British soldier might stand up to stretch, and from the German side, no one fires. They simply watch, perhaps nodding a silent acknowledgement of a shared ache in the lower back. They are all prisoners of the same landscape, all victims of the same terrible gravity. I want you to think about the letters that were written during those hazy days. They were not letters of glory or of hate. They were letters of the small things. My dear, one boy wrote, his pencil shaking with fatigue, I saw a bird today. It was small and brown, and it sat on the wire for nearly a minute. I wondered where it was going, and if it knew that we were here. It sang a little song that sounded like the brook behind your father's house. I closed my eyes and for a moment, I wasn't in the sand anymore. I was sitting on the grass with you, and the sun was gentle. The resilience of these men was not found in grand charges or loud shouts, but in the quiet, everyday heroism of staying kind. It was in the way a soldier would save the last 2 inches of his water for a comrade who was shivering with desert fever. It was in the way they shared their stories, over and over, until the memories of home became a collective shield against the darkness of the present. The days bled into the nights. The sun would vanish, leaving a sky so full of stars it felt as though you could reach up and harvest them like diamonds. The cold would rush in, sharp and sudden, and the men would huddle together under their thin blankets, their teeth chattering, their bodies seeking the warmth of a brother. In the dark, they would talk in low, melodic whispers. They talked about what they would do on the first day of peace. One wanted to eat a whole loaf of fresh, white bread with thick yellow butter. Another wanted to walk in the rain until he was soaked to the skin. Another simply wanted to sleep in a bed with white sheets and never see the sun again. These dreams were the only things that didn't grind down. The desert could take their health, it could take their comfort, and it could take their friends, but it could not take the soft, glowing images of home they carried in the secret chambers of their hearts. Imagine the sound of the desert at 3 in the morning. It is a silence so profound it has a weight to it. There is only the soft, rhythmic sighing of the wind as it reshapes the dunes, and the distant, lonely clink of metal against metal as someone, somewhere, shifts in their sleep. In this hour, there are no armies. There are only thousands of young men, lost in the middle of a wasteland, all dreaming the same dream of return. There is a story of a small, quiet moment during this stalemate. A young medic, a boy who had never wanted to see a wound in his life, found himself in a no-man's land during a rare, moonlit lull. He was looking for a soldier who had fallen earlier that day. He found him, but he also found someone else, a young man in a different uniform, also wounded, also alone. The medic didn't hesitate. He didn't ask for a name or a flag. He knelt in the sand and, in the silver light of the moon, he tended to them both. He shared his water between them. He spoke to them in a soft, soothing voice, a language of comfort that needed no translation. For that 1 hour, the war was over. There were only 3 human beings in a vast, empty world, holding on to life with their fingernails. When the sun began to rise, the medic slipped back to his own lines, and the 2 wounded men were found by their own. They never knew his name, but they carried the memory of his gentle hands for the rest of their lives. This was the true nature of the long, grinding days. It was the sanding down of all the noise and the anger, leaving only the bare, beautiful bones of human connection. The men were hollowed out by the heat and the weight, but that hollowness was filled with a new kind of love, a fierce, quiet loyalty to the person standing next to them in the dust. As the stalemate began to break, as the final storm began to gather its strength on the horizon, the men looked at one another with a profound and weary understanding. They were too tired to be afraid. They were too tired to be vengeful. They were simply ready for the end of the waiting. Elias looks at Arthur in the fading light. Lucas looks at the photograph of his wife. They all take one last, deep breath of the cooling air. They feel the sand beneath their feet, the same sand that has witnessed 1,000 years of such moments. They are part of the history of this place now, their stories woven into the very grains of the desert. The long days were coming to a close. The grinding was almost done. But in the silence of that final twilight, before the sky would once again catch fire, there was a peace that passed all understanding, a peace born of shared suffering, of quiet resilience, and of the enduring, whispered hope that even in the heart of the wasteland, kindness could still bloom like a desert flower. Sleep now, as they did, tucked into the cooling earth. The stars are watching. The wind is low. The long road is still ahead, but for tonight, the grind has stopped, and the world is soft and still. When the final order came, it did not sound like a victory cry. It sounded like a heavy, collective sigh shared by 10,000 weary souls. For days and nights without end, the desert had been a theater of iron and fire, but as the final push began, the noise seemed to retreat into a distant, rhythmic hum, leaving the men in a state of profound, hollowed-out quiet. They called the moment Operation Supercharge, a word that suggested a sudden burst of lightning or a frantic surge of energy. But to the men on the ground, the boys with sand in their lungs and shadows under their eyes, there was no lightning left. There was only the weight of the pack, the heat of the sun, and a desperation for the end that was deeper than any desire for glory. Close your eyes and feel the air of that final morning. It is a pale, translucent gray, the color of a moth's wing. The ground is cold, but you know that within an hour, the sun will turn the sand into a golden furnace once again. You are standing in a long, ragged line, your boots sinking slightly into the soft, unmapped earth. You are not thinking of the maps and the tents far behind you. You are thinking of the sheer, impossible effort it takes to lift one foot and place it in front of the other. Imagine a young man named Samuel. He is 21 years old, but in the soft light of the dawn, he looks like a man who has lived a century. He is an infantryman, a boy who once spent his Saturday afternoons cheering at football matches and dreaming of a girl with ribbons in her hair. Now, his world is the rhythmic scrape of his shovel and the heavy, metallic scent of his rifle. As the order to move forward ripples down the line, Samuel doesn't feel a surge of adrenaline. He feels a quiet, sinking numbness. He looks at the man to his left, a soldier named Thomas who has become his shadow over these long weeks. Thomas is staring straight ahead, his jaw set, but his eyes are fixed on something miles beyond the horizon. Samuel reaches out and brushes a thick layer of dust from Thomas's shoulder. It is a small gesture, a tiny spark of care in a world that has become cold and hard. Thomas doesn't turn his head, but he leans slightly into the touch, a silent acknowledgement that they are still here, still breathing, still part of the same fragile story. Nearly there, Tom, Samuel whispers. His voice is so low it is almost swallowed by the wind. "Aye," Thomas replies, his voice a dry rustle. Nearly there. The charge was not a sprint into the mouth of danger, it was a slow, deliberate walk into the unknown. It was the movement of men who were too tired to run, too tired to shout, and almost too tired to be afraid. They moved across the sand like a tide of ghosts, their shadows stretching out long and thin before them. Each step was a victory over the leaden weight of their own limbs. Each breath was a prayer for silence. The heroism of this moment was not found in the grand gestures often seen in the history books. It was found in the quiet resilience of the human heart when it has been pushed to the very edge of its endurance. It was in the way a soldier would reach out to steady a stumbling comrade, his own legs shaking with fatigue. It was in the way they shared the last, lukewarm drops of water from a shared canteen, passing it back and forth with a reverence that made the brackish liquid taste like the finest wine. As they moved through the shimmering heat haze, the desert began to play tricks on their minds. The distant ridges seemed to float and dance, turning into the familiar shapes of home. Samuel looked at a jagged limestone outcrop, and for a fleeting second, he saw the stone wall of his grandmother's garden. He could almost smell the damp earth and the sweet, heavy scent of the honeysuckle. He could almost hear the low, comforting drone of the bees. He clung to that image, using it as a shield against the blistering reality of the sand. He wasn't marching toward a battlefield. He was marching toward a chair by a fireplace, toward a bed with clean sheets, toward a world where he could sleep until the sun went down. This was the heavy heart's charge. It was a movement fueled by the collective exhaustion of thousands of men who had reached the end of their tether and decided to take one more step anyway. They were no longer fighting for territory or for flags. They were fighting for the right to stop. They were fighting for the silence that would follow the storm. In the middle of the advance, a small, beautiful moment of humanity flickered to life. A young medic, his white armband stained with the gray dust of the desert, found a soldier lying in the shade of a broken tank. The soldier was not one of his own. He wore a different uniform, a different color of wool. He was young, barely a man, and he was clutching a small, leather-bound book to his chest. The medic didn't see an enemy. He saw a boy who was thirsty and alone. He knelt in the sand, the heat of the metal hole radiating against his back, and gently lifted the boy's head. He poured a little water onto a clean rag and dabbed the boy's parched, cracked lips. He spoke in a soft, soothing tone, a language of comfort that transcended the borders of nations. The boy opened his eyes, a look of profound confusion softening into a weak, trembling smile. He reached out and touched the medic's sleeve, a silent thank you that echoed through the vast, empty dunes. For that 1 minute, the supercharge didn't exist. There was only a quiet act of kindness between two souls who were both desperate for the fire to go out. The sun climbed higher, turning the sky into a brilliant, aching blue. The ground beneath their feet began to vibrate with the low, constant thrumming of distant machinery, but to the men in the line, it felt as though they were walking through a dream. They were numb to the noise, numb to the danger, and numb to the very concept of victory. When word finally began to filter back that the lines were breaking, that the end was finally in sight, there were no cheers. There were no hats thrown into the air. Samuel heard the news and simply sat down in the sand. He felt the heat of the earth seeping through his trousers, and for the first time in weeks, he let his shoulders drop. He looked at his hands. They were stained with grease, scarred by the grit, and trembling with an uncontrollable fatigue. He didn't feel like a victor. He felt like a man who had finally been allowed to put down a crushing weight. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a letter he had started days ago. The paper was soft and frayed, the edges darkened by the sweat of his body. He looked at the words he had written to his mother, telling her about the stars and the wind. He picked up his pencil, but he didn't write about the charge. He didn't write about the breakthrough. "The sun is going down now," he wrote, his handwriting small and shaky. "It is very quiet. I think I will be able to sleep tonight. I am so tired, Mother. I just want to come home and sit in the garden and listen to the rain. I think the rain is the most beautiful sound in the world." Around him, the rest of the men were settling into the same heavy, thoughtful silence. They were scattered across the desert like pieces of a broken toy, huddled together in small groups, their heads resting on their packs. They looked at the horizon not with triumph, but with a profound, weary relief. The long road was not yet over, but the great weight had shifted. They had given everything they had, and then they had found a little more to give, not out of a love for war, but out of a desperate, beautiful love for the peace that lay beyond it. The evening light began to soften, turning the dunes into waves of deep purple and indigo. The wind picked up, a cool, evening breeze that whispered over the empty shell casings and the abandoned trenches. It was a gentle sound, a sigh of the earth itself as it prepared for the night. The heavy heart's charge was done. The men of El Alamein had walked through the fire, and though they were scarred and exhausted beyond measure, they had carried their humanity with them. In the starlight, the desert looked serene, a vast, silver ocean that hid the struggles of the day beneath its quiet surface. Samuel closed his eyes, the letter tucked safely against his heart. He listened to the breathing of the men around him, a rhythmic, collective pulse of life in the middle of the wasteland. He wasn't a hero in a newsreel. He was a boy who had survived a storm, and as he drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep, the only thing he felt was the quiet, miraculous weight of the silence. The desert was still. The charge was over. And for the first time in a very long time, the hearts of the men were light enough to dream of home. There is a specific, hollow sound to a world coming apart at its seams, a quiet fraying that begins not with a roar, but with a long, drawn-out silence. For weeks, the line in the sand had been held together by nothing more than the stubborn, desperate will of men who had forgotten the meaning of rest. They had lived in the dust until their skin became part of it. They had shared their breath, their water, and their fears until they were no longer individuals, but a single, weary heartbeat stretched across the desert. But now, that heartbeat was beginning to falter. The thread that had bound them to their purpose, to their commanders, and to the very earth they defended was finally, inevitably, starting to snap. Close your eyes and imagine the stillness of a command post that has gone cold. The radios, which once hummed with the frantic energy of 1,000 voices, now emit only a soft, rhythmic static, a lonely sound that mimics the washing of a distant sea. The maps, once covered in proud, sweeping arrows, are now just paper, fluttering in the dry evening breeze. The orders have stopped coming. The grand designs of the world far away have finally lost their grip on this small corner of the sand. In a shallow dugout near the edge of the ridge, a young man named Stefan sat with his back against the earth. He was 20 years old, though his eyes held the weight of a much longer life. In his lap sat a small, dented tin of rations, which he had been too tired to open for hours. He was watching a single thread on the cuff of his sleeve, pulled loose by the jagged edge of a steel crate. He watched as the wind toyed with it, pulling it further and further from the fabric until the sleeve began to unravel, one tiny stitch at a time. To Stefan, that thread was the whole world. It was the supply lines that had finally run dry. It was the letters from home that had stopped arriving. It was the brotherhood that was now being scattered like leaves in a storm. There is a profound, quiet sorrow in realizing that your incredible endurance, the months of thirst, the nights of shivering cold, the loss of friends who had become more than brothers, was not enough to hold back the tide. It is not a realization that comes with a scream, it comes with a deep, heavy sigh. It is the feeling of a body finally allowing itself to feel its own weight. Across the trench, an older soldier named Klaus watched him. Klaus had been a clockmaker in a small town before the world turned to iron. He understood the way things were built, and he understood the way they eventually wound down. He saw the fraying thread on Stefan's sleeve and did not offer a word of command. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, wooden needle case he had carried since the beginning. Without a word, Klaus moved through the shadows. He sat beside the young man and took the frayed cuff into his large, calloused hands. In the dim light of the rising moon, he began to sew. He didn't have the right color of thread, he used a pale, ghostly white, but he worked with a tenderness that made the act feel like a benediction. Everything has an end, Stefan, Klaus whispered, his voice as soft as the shifting sand outside. The clocks run out of tension. The thread runs out of length. It is not a failure of the spring, it is simply the nature of the machine. Stefan looked at the older man's hands, watching the needle flash rhythmically in the moonlight. For a moment, the war disappeared. The lack of fuel for the tanks, the empty water barrels, the silence of the radio, it all faded. There was only the quiet, steady repair of a sleeve. It was a small moment of kindness, a tiny act of everyday heroism in a world that was falling apart. It was a way of saying that even when the line breaks, we remain human to one another. The unraveling was happening everywhere, in 1,000 quiet ways. It was in the eyes of the drivers who looked at their empty fuel gauges and simply turned off their engines, leaning their heads against the steering wheels in a state of numb acceptance. It was in the hands of the loaders who found their ammunition crates empty and chose to sit in the shade of their steel machines, sharing a last, dry crust of bread. It was the realization that the struggle had moved beyond their control, and that the desert was now the only master left. Imagine a group of men sitting together in the dark, their shadows merging into one another. They were not talking about retreat, for that word still felt too heavy to speak aloud. They were talking about the taste of the first thing they wanted to eat when they got home. One spoke of a thick, dark soup made by his grandmother. Another spoke of a simple piece of fruit, cold and wet from the cellar. They spoke of these things with a quiet, reverent intensity, as if the words themselves could provide the sustenance they no longer had. They were realizing, in the soft, bruised light of the evening, that they had been holding onto a ghost. The line they had bled for was no longer a wall, it was a memory. The fraying thread had finally snapped, and they were now just men, far from home, lost in a landscape that did not know their names. There is a specific kind of resilience found in defeat, a quiet, dignified strength that allows a person to stand up, shake the dust from their coat, and face the unknown with a steady heart. As the orders to move back finally began to filter through the ranks, not as a shout but as a weary murmur, the men did not panic. They moved with a slow, zombified grace. They helped one another pack their meager belongings. They shared the last few drops of water, measuring them out with a precision that was heartbreaking. Stefan felt the repair Klaus had made on his sleeve. The white thread stood out against the dark wool, a scar of care on a garment of war. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of love for the man beside him, and for all the men who were even now beginning the long, slow walk into the dark. They had been asked for everything, and they had given it. Their endurance had been a masterpiece of the human spirit, even if it had not changed the map. In the command trailers, the officers were burning papers. The smell of charred ink and ash drifted through the camp, a bitter incense for the end of a dream. Rommel, the leader they had looked to as a magician of the dunes, was now just a man with a tired face, watching the embers glow in the dark. He knew the thread was gone. He knew the cloth was ruined. And he knew that his only task now was to try and gather the loose ends before they were lost forever to the wind. The night air grew cold, as it always did, but the chill felt deeper tonight. It was the cold of a house with its doors left open. The men huddled together, not as soldiers of an empire, but as children seeking warmth. They whispered to one another in the dark, their voices sounding like the rustle of dry grass. They told the old stories one more time, the stories of the first day they arrived, the stories of the jokes they had played, the stories of the friends who were no longer there to hear them. They were weaving a new thread now, one made of memory and shared sorrow. It was a thread that would prove to be stronger than any military line, a thread that would stretch across the years and the oceans, long after the sand had buried their tanks and the wind had erased their trenches. Stefan looked out at the horizon, where the first hint of a new day was beginning to gray the edge of the world. He felt the weight of his pack on his shoulders, but it felt different now. It was no longer the weight of a mission, it was the weight of a journey. He reached out and touched Klaus's arm, a silent signal that he was ready to move. "Thank you for the stitch, Klaus," he whispered. Klaus nodded, his face a landscape of shadows. "Keep it safe, Stefan. It will hold for a while yet." They stood up together, two small shapes against the vastness of the desert. Around them, the camp was waking up to its new reality. There were no bugles, no shouts of defiance. There was only the rhythmic, steady sound of thousands of boots beginning to trudge toward the west. The line had broken. The thread had frayed. But as they walked together, their shoulders brushing in the dark, finding a strange and beautiful peace in the simple act of moving on. The desert wind picked up, catching the ash from the burnt maps and carrying it away into the void. It sighed over the abandoned equipment and the empty trenches, a soft, mournful song for the end of an era. The world was changing, the tide was turning, and the men of the desert were finally letting go of the earth they had held so tightly. Sleep now, as the thread of this story begins its own slow turn toward the west. The stars are fading, the night is nearly done, and the long road is waiting. But for this moment, in the quiet of the retreat, there is only the soft, steady rhythm of the walk, and the warmth of the man walking beside you. In the deepest part of the night, words can sometimes carry the weight of an entire world. Inside the small, metal-walled command trailer, the silence was absolute, save for the low, rhythmic hiss of a kerosene lamp. The light was a soft, amber glow that flickered against the maps pinned to the walls, casting long, dancing shadows that looked like ghostly fingers reaching across the sand. Erwin Rommel sat at his small wooden desk, his head resting in his hands. The desert outside was cold and vast, a blue-black ocean of stillness that seemed to be waiting for a single breath to change its course. On the desk before him lay a single piece of paper. It had arrived through the static of the radio, a series of sharp, mechanical pulses from a world thousands of miles away. It was a message from Berlin, from a man sitting in a comfortable, heated room, surrounded by the echoes of his own power. The words on the paper were few, but they were as cold and sharp as a winter frost. They commanded the men of the desert to stand exactly where they were. They forbade any retreat, any movement to save the lives of those who remained. It was a command for victory, or for a quiet, final disappearance beneath the dunes. Rommel stared at the ink, but he did not see the letters. He saw faces. He saw the face of the young aide who had brought him his tea only an hour before, a boy with eyes as bright and clear as the sky over the Alps. He saw the faces of the tank crews, their skin stained with the grease and oil of their metal homes. He saw the infantrymen, huddled in their shallow trenches, their boots worn thin and their canteens echoing with the hollow sound of thirst. These were not numbers on a ledger. They were not colored pins on a map. They were husbands who had promised to return. There were sons who still had the scent of their mothers' kitchens in their memories. There were men who had given everything to the sand, trusting that their commander would know when the path had finally reached its end. To stand and die is an easy thing to command from a distance. It is a poetic notion for those who do not have to feel the grit in their teeth or the ache in their bones. But here, in the heart of the wasteland, the reality was much quieter and much more devastating. Rommel felt a deep, slow-burning sorrow settle in his chest. For a lifetime, he had been a man of duty, a man who believed in the structure of an order as if it were the bedrock of the earth itself. But tonight, that bedrock was crumbling. He rose from his chair and walked to the small, scratched window of the trailer. He looked out at the camp. It was a landscape of shadow and silver. He could see the silhouettes of the trucks, their engines quiet for now. He could hear the soft, mournful whistle of the wind as it played through the camouflage netting. Somewhere in the distance, a soldier was coughing, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to punctuate the silence of the dunes. He thought of the order again. Victory or death. It was a phrase designed for a history book, not for a living, breathing human being. He realized, with a clarity that was both peaceful and agonizing, that he could not follow it. He could not offer up the thousands of young men who looked to him for guidance as a sacrifice to a pride that was not their own. His loyalty was no longer to the ink on the paper or the man who had sent it. His loyalty was to the heartbeats he could hear in the quiet of the night. This was his quiet defiance. It was not a loud shout or a dramatic gesture. It was a slow, deliberate turning toward the light of humanity. He returned to his desk and picked up a pencil. It felt heavy in his hand, as if it were made of lead and stone. He began to write, but he did not write a reply to Berlin. He wrote the orders for the retreat. He wrote the path for the long road west. He mapped out the ways to save the men, to pull them back from the edge of the abyss, to give them a chance to see the rain fall on green grass once again. Each word he wrote was a betrayal of his command, but a preservation of his soul. He felt a strange, hushed peace as he worked. The tension that had held his shoulders tight for weeks began to melt away, replaced by a profound, weary resolve. He was defying the dark. He was choosing the warmth of a living hand over the cold finality of an ideology. In a trench not far from the trailer, a young corporal named Hans was trying to sleep. He was wrapped in a thin, tattered blanket, his head resting on a sandbag. He was dreaming of his father's workshop, the sound of a saw moving through wood, the sweet smell of cedar shavings. In his dream, he was safe. But the cold of the desert night kept pulling him back to the surface. He opened his eyes and saw the stars, those distant and different lights. He wondered if anyone in the world knew he was here. He wondered if his life mattered to the great machine of the war. He saw a light flickering in the commander's trailer and felt a small, inexplicable sense of comfort. He knew the general was awake. He didn't know about the telegram from Berlin. He didn't know about the impossible choice being made behind those metal walls. He only knew that he wasn't alone in the dark. Inside the trailer, Rommel finished the last of the orders. He folded the papers with a steady hand. He knew that by tomorrow, the world would see him as a man who had failed his mission. He knew that the people who sent the telegram would never forgive him for choosing the lives of his soldiers over the glory of a lost cause. But as he blew out the kerosene lamp, plunging the room into the soft, blue light of the moon, he knew he had made the only choice a man could live with. The victory or death order remained on the desk, a forgotten piece of paper that had lost its power to harm. He stepped out of the trailer and into the cool air. The desert felt different now. It was no longer a cage, it was a road. He walked through the camp, his boots making a soft, rhythmic crunch in the gravel. He passed the sleeping men, their breathing a collective, gentle pulse under the starlight. He felt a fierce, protective love for them, a bond that was deeper than any oath of office. He was their shepherd, and he would lead them home, even if he had to walk through the shadows to do it. He thought of Lucy, his wife, and the quiet garden they shared. He thought of the mountains and the mist. He realized that the greatest act of courage he had ever performed was not a charge on a battlefield or a clever maneuver in the sand. It was this, sitting in a small room and deciding that a human life was worth more than a piece of paper. The morning would bring chaos. It would bring the roar of engines and the frantic rush to move before the sun climbed too high. There would be confusion, and there would be fear. But there would also be a way out. The thread that had been fraying for so long was now being held together by the will of a man who had rediscovered his own humanity in the heart of the wasteland. Rommel looked up at the sky. The stars were beginning to fade, and a soft, ghostly gray was bleeding into the eastern horizon. The night was ending. He took a deep, steady breath, the cold air filling his lungs. He felt old, and he felt tired, but for the first time in a very long time, he felt right. He went back to the men. He woke the officers with a soft voice, not a barked command. He told them to prepare the trucks. He told them to gather the water. He told them they were moving west. He saw the look of sudden, overwhelming relief in their eyes, a light that was brighter than any sunrise. They didn't ask about the orders from Berlin. They didn't need to. They saw it in the face of their commander, the weight had been lifted, and the path was clear. As the first golden rays of the sun touched the tops of the dunes, turning the desert into a sea of fire, the army began to stir. But it was a different kind of movement than before. It was the movement of a family preparing for a journey. There was a quiet efficiency, a shared purpose, and a new, fragile hope that rippled through the ranks like a cool breeze. The great retreat was beginning. They were leaving the earth they had fought so hard to hold, but they were taking their lives with them. They were walking away from the dark, toward a horizon that held the possibility of a tomorrow. Rommel watched them go from the seat of his open car. He saw Hans, the young corporal, climb into the back of a lorry, his face smudged with dust but his eyes clear. He saw the tank crew securing their hatches, their hands steady. He felt a profound, quiet gratitude that he had been able to give them this chance. The world would remember the battle. It would remember the maps and the strategy and the legends of the fox. But the desert would remember this moment, the moment a man chose to be a human being instead of a general. It would remember the silence of a trailer in the dark and the scratch of a pencil that saved 1,000 dreams. Sleep now, as the army moves across the sand, a long, winding river of life in the middle of the wasteland. The fire is behind them, and the road is long, but they are moving together, protected by the quiet courage of a man who decided that the dark would not have the final word. The stars have faded, the sun is high, and the journey has begun. The desert has a long memory, but it keeps its stories buried deep beneath the shifting waves of sand, hidden from the eyes of the world. When the order to move finally rippled through the ranks, it didn't come with the fanfare of a new campaign or the sharp energy of a fresh start. It arrived as a low, weary murmur that passed from one man to the next, a soft breath of wind that seemed to deflate the very spirit of the army. The long road west began not with a march, but with a slow, heavy exhale. Behind them lay the earth they had bled for, the trenches they had called home, and the echoes of a struggle that had finally reached its limit. Before them lay a vast, shimmering emptiness, a ribbon of dust that stretched toward a horizon they could no longer see. Close your eyes and imagine the sound of 10,000 boots moving in unison across the gravel. It is not the crisp, rhythmic snap of a parade ground. It is a soft, sliding crunch. A shuffle. A rhythmic, hypnotic sigh of leather meeting grit. This was the heartbeat of the retreat, a slow, steady pulse of endurance that would continue for miles and days until time itself seemed to dissolve into the heat. Among the thousands was a young man named Johann. He had been in the desert for a year, long enough for the sun to bake the memory of his former life into something thin and translucent. As he turned his back on the lines of El Alamein, he felt a strange, hollow lightness in his chest. His pack was heavy, his rifle was a cold weight against his shoulder, but the burden of holding the ground was gone. Now, there was only the walk. He walked with his head down, watching the heels of the man in front of him. To look up was to be overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the landscape. The desert was a sea of pale gold and bruised violet, a world that did not care if they stayed or if they left. It was an uncaring witness to their exhaustion. Johann found a strange comfort in the rhythm of his own steps. Step, breathe. Step, breathe. It was a meditation of the weary. But the hardest part of the long road was not the heat or the thirst. It was the leaving. As the column moved slowly away from the old positions, they passed the small, quiet clusters of graves that marked their journey across the sand. They were simple things, 2 pieces of rough wood tied together with a bit of wire, or perhaps just a helmet resting on a mound of stones. Johann passed the grave of a friend he had known since the first day in the dust. He didn't stop. He couldn't. To stop was to break the spell of the march, to let the exhaustion finally catch up and pull him down into the sand. Instead, he touched his fingers to his lips and then reached out, letting his hand graze the top of a wooden cross as he shuffled past. It was a silent apology. It was a promise to carry the memory of that friend's laughter, the way he had shared his last bit of chocolate, the way he had talked about the rain in the Black Forest. As the grave receded into the shimmering haze behind them, Johann felt a sharp, quiet ache. They were leaving their brothers behind in the silence of the dunes, and the desert was already beginning to weave a blanket of sand over their names. The retreat was a journey of ghosts. The men moved like sleepwalkers, their eyes fixed on the dust raised by the vehicle in front of them. They were so tired that the world became a series of small, sensory details. The salt on their lips. The way the light caught the fine, silver hair on a comrade's neck. The rhythmic clink of a canteen against a belt. In the heat of the afternoon, the landscape became a hallucination. The distant ridges seemed to float above the ground, and the air shimmered like water. No one spoke. To speak was to waste moisture, to break the fragile concentration required to keep moving. There were a column of shadows, drifting across an ancient earth that had seen 1,000 armies come and go, and would see 1,000 more. Yet, even in this state of zombified trudging, the human spirit found small ways to shine. Johann felt a hand steady him as he stumbled over a loose stone. He didn't look back, but he knew it was Dieter, an older man who had become a kind of father to the younger soldiers. A few minutes later, Johann saw Dieter's pace begin to flag. Without a word, Johann reached out and took the heavy spare tire Dieter was carrying, slinging it over his own shoulder. They didn't exchange thanks. They didn't need to. In the long road west, kindness was not a gesture, it was a survival tactic. It was the invisible thread that kept the column from unraveling. When the sun finally began to sink, the desert underwent its daily, beautiful transformation. The harsh, white glare softened into a rich, honeyed gold. The shadows of the men stretched out for yards, turning the column into a procession of giants. The air grew cool, a sharp, sudden relief that made the skin prickle. They would stop for a few hours in the dark, huddling together for warmth. There were no fires, for the sky was still a place of danger. They sat in the sand, leaning against the cold metal of the trucks, eating their meager rations in a silence that was profound. Johann pulled a letter from his pocket. It was the one he had been carrying for months, the paper now soft and felt-like from constant handling. He couldn't read it in the dark, but he knew the curves of the letters by heart. He traced the lines with his thumb, imagining his mother's kitchen, the scent of fresh bread, the sound of the clock ticking on the mantel. These memories were his compass. They were the reason he kept his feet moving when his body screamed for him to stop. He looked at the men around him. In the starlight, their faces were etched with a deep, universal sorrow. They were realizing that the dream of a grand victory had vanished, replaced by the simple, desperate hope of seeing home again. They were no longer soldiers of an empire, they were just boys who were very, very tired. A young Italian soldier nearby began to hum a low, mournful tune, a song about a girl in a vineyard. It was a soft, melodic sound that seemed to float on the night air, weaving between the resting men. One by one, others joined in, their voices a hushed, whispered choir in the middle of the wasteland. It wasn't a song of defiance. It was a song of longing. It was a way of reminding themselves that they still had souls, even if their bodies were broken. The moon rose, a pale, indifferent orb that turned the desert into a landscape of bone and silver. It watched the tiny, fragile line of humanity as it began to move once again. The rest was over. The road was still long. The trudge resumed. Crunch, shuffle, sigh. They passed abandoned equipment, tanks that had run out of fuel, lorries with shattered axles. These steel skeletons sat in the moonlight like monuments to a lost world. The men walked past them without a glance. The machines were dead, but the men were still moving. They were the only things that mattered now. Johann found himself falling into a light trance. He dreamed as he walked. He dreamed of a river, a cool, rushing stream of water that never ended. He felt the splash of it against his legs. He felt the spray on his face. He walked for miles in that dream, his feet moving automatically, his mind far away in a world of green and blue. This was the quiet resilience of the human heart. It creates its own sanctuary when the world offers none. It finds a way to endure the unendurable by retreating into the soft, safe corners of the memory. As the first hint of gray began to touch the eastern horizon, Johann looked back one last time. The dunes of El Alamein were gone, swallowed by the distance and the dark. The road behind was empty, a ribbon of dust that would soon be erased by the morning wind. He felt a sudden, sharp pang of grief for the earth they had left. Not for the territory, but for the time they had spent there. They were leaving a piece of their youth in that sand. They were leaving the versions of themselves that still believed the world was a simple place. He turned his face to the west. The sky was beginning to turn a pale, dusty rose. The air was growing warm again. He adjusted the strap of his pack and took a deep, steady breath. One more day, he whispered to the man in front of him. The man didn't answer, but his shoulders straightened just a fraction. The long road west continued. It was a journey of 1,000 miles, measured in single, agonizing steps. It was a story of a great unraveling, a haunting retreat across a landscape that would eventually forget they were ever there. But for now, the boots continued their rhythmic song. The shadows continued their long, slow dance. And the men continued to walk, carrying their letters, their memories, and their quiet, everyday heroism toward a horizon that promised nothing but the next step. Sleep now, as the column moves through the silver light of the desert night. The road is long, and the stars are distant, but you are not alone. The rhythm of the walk is a lullaby, a soft, steady pulse that carries the weary toward the dawn. The sand is quiet. The wind is low. And the journey continues, one breath at a time. The great, thundering heart of the world has finally stopped its beating, leaving behind a silence so deep you can hear the stars as they begin to wake. The storm has passed. The iron has gone cold. The frantic, shouting energy that had consumed this small stretch of North Africa for so long has drifted away, carried off like smoke on a cooling breeze. At El Alamein, the air no longer vibrates with the roar of engines or the sharp, stinging crack of artillery. Instead, there is only the sound of the desert breathing, a soft, rhythmic sighing of wind over sand that has been here since the beginning of time and will remain long after we are gone. If you were to walk across this landscape now, in the silver blue light of a fading twilight, you would see a world caught in a strange, motionless trance. The dunes have begun to settle. The dust, which for weeks had hung like a golden veil over the struggle, has finally returned to the earth. Everything is still. The tanks, those once mighty beasts of steel, sit like rusted monuments in the moonlight, their shadows stretching out long and quiet across the gravel. They are no longer machines of war, they are merely empty shells, cooling in the night air, their metal skin making soft, occasional ticking sounds as it contracts. Among these quiet giants, a few living souls move with a slow, heavy grace. They are the ones who stayed behind, the survivors of a storm that has left them hollowed and hushed. There is no cheering here. There are no songs of victory, and no shouts of defiance. There is only the work of the hands and the heavy, quiet meditation of the heart. Imagine a young man named David. He is an Allied soldier, but tonight, his uniform feels like a weight he no longer knows how to carry. He moves across a ridge where, only a day ago, the world was a chaos of fire. Now, it is a graveyard of secrets. He carries a small, wooden spade and a pocketful of smooth stones he gathered from the shore of the Mediterranean. David stops beside a shallow depression in the sand. He finds a helmet resting there, half covered by a drift of pale dust. It is not a helmet from his own side. It is a different shape, a different gray. But as David kneels in the cooling sand, he does not see an enemy. He sees the absence of a life. He sees a boy who likely had a mother waiting in a quiet village far to the north, a boy who probably dreamed of the smell of pine trees and the sound of cold mountain streams. With slow, deliberate movements, David begins the work of the burial. There is no ceremony, no bugle call. There is only the soft, rhythmic scrape of the spade against the grit. It is a gentle sound, a lullaby for the earth. He works with a tenderness that is profound, tucking the sand around the edges of the grave as if he were smoothing the blankets of a sleeping brother. When he is finished, he places one of his smooth sea stones at the head of the mound. It is a small, quiet anchor in a shifting world, a way of saying to the desert, someone was here. Someone was loved. This was the everyday heroism of the aftermath. It was the refusal to let the landscape swallow the humanity of those who fell. All across the miles of El Alamein, men like David were performing these final acts of grace. They moved through the dark like ghosts, burying the fallen of both sides, often sharing a canteen of water with a former adversary as they worked together to honor the dead. In the silence of the desert night, the lines on the maps had vanished completely. There were only people, tired and broken, trying to mend the world one small grave at a time. As the moon climbs higher, turning the sand into a pale, translucent ocean, the hardest work of all begins. In a small, canvas tent pitched against the wind, a young corporal named Thomas sits by the light of a single, flickering candle. Before him is a stack of small, rectangular cards and a fountain pen that feels as heavy as a mountain in his hand. Thomas is a clerk, a man whose war has been fought with ink and paper, but tonight, his task is more difficult than any charge across a minefield. He must write the letters. He must find the words to tell a mother in a rain-washed city that her son will not be coming home. He must find a way to describe the end of a life without using the language of violence. He bites his lip, the candle flame dancing in his eyes, and begins to write. He was not alone, Thomas whispers to the empty air as he moves the pen across the page. The stars were very bright that night. He was thinking of you, and he was at peace. He tells stories of small kindnesses. He writes about the way a fallen friend had once shared his last biscuit, or the way he had hummed a song to keep the younger boys calm during a dust storm. He weaves the history of the battle into a tapestry of personal memories, trying to give the families something to hold onto besides a name and a date. Each letter is a fragile bridge built over a vast and terrible silence. Each word is a quiet prayer for the living. Outside the tent, the wind is beginning to pick up. It is a low, mournful whistle that speaks of the great reclamation. The desert is a restless, impatient entity, and it has already begun the work of erasing the tracks of the struggle. If you look closely at the sand in the moonlight, you can see the ripples of the wind moving over the footprints and the tire tracks. One by one, the marks of the men and the machines are being softened and smoothed. The sharp edges of the trenches are crumbling, the sand falling back into the holes like a gentle, golden rain. The tracks of the Great Retreat are being swept away, the evidence of 1,000 agonizing steps vanishing into the indigo dark. The desert does not take sides. It does not remember the color of a tunic or the language of a prayer. It only knows the weight of the sand and the movement of the wind. It is as if the earth itself is trying to heal, drawing a vast, silver blanket over the scars we have carved into its surface. There is a strange, haunting beauty in this vanishing. It is a reminder of our own fragility, of the way we pass through the world like shadows over a dune. The great struggle, with all its noise and its passion, is becoming a part of the ancient silence. The wind carries away the scent of smoke and the echo of the guns, replacing them with the scent of salt and the sound of the void. In a few hours, the sun will rise. It will be a soft, golden dawn, and it will find a landscape that looks almost as it did 1,000 years ago. The dunes will be perfect and unbroken. The light will dance on the ridges of the limestone, and the air will be clear and still. Only those who were there, the survivors moving slowly through the morning light, will know what lies beneath the surface. They will carry the memories of the names, the faces, and the shared cups of water. They will carry the weight of the silence in their bones. But for now, the moon is still high, and the wind is still working. David sits on a ridge, looking out over the quiet battlefield. He feels the cold air against his face, and he listens to the rhythmic hush of the sand moving against the metal of a nearby tank. He feels a profound, weary peace. The work is done. The graves are marked. The letters are written. He is tired in a way that goes beyond the body, a weariness of the soul that can only be cured by time and the sound of the rain. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out the last of his smooth sea stones. He holds it for a moment, feeling its cool, solid weight. Then, he reaches out and presses it into the sand beside him. It is his own mark, his own small defiance against the wind. Rest now, he whispers to the desert. Rest now. The silence of El Alamein is absolute. It is a silence that swallows the past and cradles the future. It is the silence of the earth reclaiming its own, of the wind smoothing the tracks of the weary, and of the heart finally finding the strength to let go. Sleep now, as the desert sleeps. The fire is gone, the noise has faded, and the world is soft and still. The stars are watching, the moon is silver, and the wind is whispering a gentle goodbye to the dunes. The story of the struggle is being written in the sand, and as the night turns toward the dawn, the only thing that remains is the peace of the desert and the enduring, quiet memory of the brave. The years have a way of drifting like the sand, covering the sharp edges of the past until only the softest, most quiet memories remain. If you were to stand at El Alamein today, you would find a world that has largely forgotten the thunder of engines and the heat of the fire. The desert, in its ancient and patient wisdom, has reclaimed almost everything we once carved into its surface. The deep trenches that once held the weight of 1,000 fears have been smoothed over by the wind, filled in grain by grain until the earth is level and still once more. The jagged lines of the minefields, those hidden gardens of steel, have been buried beneath new dunes that shift and dance in the breeze, hiding the secrets of the past under a blanket of gold. Even the rusted skeletons of the great iron tanks are slowly being swallowed, their metal returning to the dust, becoming part of the landscape they once sought to conquer. To the casual eye, the desert is healed. It is a vast, serene ocean of light, a place where the only sound is the rhythmic sighing of the wind and the occasional cry of a bird passing overhead. But for those who carry the memory of that place in their hearts, the scars remain, tucked away like pressed flowers in the pages of an old book. Imagine an old man sitting in a sunlit garden in a quiet corner of New Zealand, or perhaps by a frost-covered window in a small town near the Baltic Sea. He is far away from the sand now, surrounded by the green of the trees and the comfort of a life well lived. But sometimes, when the light hits the floor at a certain angle, or the wind whistles through a doorway in a particular way, he is transported back. He isn't back in the struggle, not in the way the history books describe it. He is back in a quiet moment of kindness. He remembers the taste of a shared cigarette in the dark of a moonlit trench. He remembers the warmth of a friend's shoulder when the desert night turned to ice. He remembers the face of a young man from the other side, a boy he met for only a fleeting second across a stretch of wire, and the silent, mutual look of exhaustion they shared. These are the scars that do not hurt. They are the marks of a shared humanity that refused to be extinguished by the dark. They are the stories that live beneath the sand. The survivors of El Alamein brought the desert home with them. They carried it in the way they cherished a glass of cold, clear water. They carried it in the way they looked at the stars, knowing that the same constellations had watched over them when they were lost in the wasteland. They carried it in the letters they kept in wooden boxes in their attics, fragile, yellowed pieces of paper that still smell faintly of salt and old dust. These letters are the true history of the desert. They are the records of boys who were lonely, of men who were brave in small, invisible ways, and of a generation that learned the value of peace in the hardest school imaginable. There is a profound and beautiful irony in the way the memory of the desert binds these men together. Years after the fire went out, survivors from both sides began to find one another. They didn't meet to talk of victory or defeat, they met to talk of the sand. They discovered that they had dreamed the same dreams of rain. They discovered that they had written the same words to their mothers. They discovered that the enemy was simply another person who had been just as thirsty, just as tired, and just as desperate to see the green fields of home again. In these quiet meetings, the last of the scars began to soften. The brotherhood of the sand transcended the borders of nations and the ideologies of the past. It became a community of those who had seen the world at its most indifferent and had responded by holding on to one another. They were the ones who knew that a shared crust of bread or a whispered word of encouragement was worth more than all the maps in the world. As we look back on the long road that led to El Alamein and the long road that led away from it, we find a story not of iron, but of the spirit. We see the quiet resilience of the human heart, which can endure the blistering heat and the freezing dark and still find a way to love. We see the everyday heroism of the medic who tended to the stranger, the sapper who walked slowly through the dark to clear a path for his friends, and the general who chose the lives of his men over the demands of a ghost. The desert has healed its surface, but the history remains in the layers beneath. It is a history made of silver sea stones placed on lonely graves. It is a history made of white cotton tape marking a safe road through the void. It is a history made of the names whispered into the night air, names that the wind has carried across the ocean to the ears of those who waited. Tonight, as the sun sets over the dunes of El Alamein, the light is soft and gold. The shadows stretch out across the sand, long and peaceful. There is no noise here now, only the gentle, persistent breath of the earth. The scars are hidden, the struggle is over, and the world is at rest. We think of the men who never left the sand, the boys who are still sleeping under the watchful eyes of the desert stars. We wish them a deep and lasting peace. We think of the survivors who are now drifting into their own long sleep, their hearts finally light, their memories of the dust fading into the soft, cool mist of home. We wish them a quiet rest, free from the heat and the thirst. And we think of ourselves, the ones who listen to their stories in the quiet of the night. We carry their legacy not in the knowledge of their movements or their dates, but in the understanding of their humanity. We learn from them that even in the most desolate wasteland, kindness is possible. We learn that even when the world is on fire, we can still be anchors for one another. We learn that the most enduring things we leave behind are not the marks we make on the earth, but the moments of grace we share in the dark. The story of Rommel's last stand is not a story of an end, but of a long, slow turning toward the light. It is a reminder that the desert, for all its vastness and its power, is eventually reclaimed by the silence. And in that silence, we find the truth of who we are. The wind is low now. The stars are bright and steady. The sand is cool beneath the moon. The journey is finished, the letters are all delivered, and the road has finally led us home. Sleep now, as the desert sleeps. The history is written, the memories are safe, and the world is cocooned in a soft, silver peace. The scars are beneath the sand, and the sand is quiet, and the stars are watching over us all. Close your eyes, breathe in the cool, night air, and let the rhythm of the desert wind carry you into a deep and dreamless rest. Everything is still. Everything is at peace. The desert has reclaimed the earth, and the heart has found its way home.